In a world fractured by empire and loyalty, one man rose not as a conqueror, but as a question. Could virtue and restraint build a nation where kings once ruled? His name was George Washington. Before we begin, tell us where you are listening from and subscribe to join this journey through history's turning point. The story of George Washington begins not in the halls of power, but on the edges of a vast and uncertain wilderness. The early 18th century was an age of expansion, when European empires competed for dominion across a continent they barely understood. In these remote colonies, life balanced between refinement and hardship, and the ideal of a gentleman coexisted uneasily with the realities of survival. Virginia, the largest and wealthiest of Britain's 13 colonies, was a place of promise and division. Its tobacco plantations brought fortune to a few and servitude to many. The people who lived there were bound by hierarchy and by the distant authority of a king. Yet the distance between London and the Potomac was more than physical. It was also a distance of experience, of daily struggle, and of quiet independence. It was within this landscape that a child named George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732. He came into a world defined by order and expectation. His father, Augustine Washington, was a man of ambition, managing farms and ironworks in the colony's growing economy. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, represented discipline, faith, and unyielding perseverance. From her, George would inherit a sense of moral firmness that bordered on austerity. From his father, who died when George was only 11, he would learn that opportunity in the colonies demanded self-reliance and careful judgment. In his earliest years, George's world was small: fields, rivers, and the constant rhythm of plantation life. Yet even within that confinement, the boy began to observe the geography that would later shape his destiny. He learned to ride horses with skill, to measure land with precision, and to carry himself with a dignity unusual for his age. His education was limited to basic mathematics, reading and writing, but he was attentive and exacting. Knowledge for him would come not from books, but from the landscape itself. The death of his father marked a silent turning point. Without a formal inheritance from Augustine's earlier marriage, young George was left with modest prospects. In Virginia's social order, lineage and land defined one's future. But George Washington would learn to substitute diligence for birthright. He sought advancement through discipline and duty, a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. By his mid-teens, Washington had taken to surveying, a profession both practical and adventurous. In the wilderness beyond the settled lands, he found his first true education. The vast forests of the Shenandoah Valley taught him the contours of risk and endurance. Surveying demanded precision and courage, for the frontier was both opportunity and danger. Through these expeditions, Washington encountered the raw immensity of the land that would one day become the United States. The experience left an imprint, a sense of space, a respect for nature's indifference, and an understanding of geography as power. The world around him was also shifting. The great powers of Europe, Britain and France, watched each other warily across oceans and mountains. Their ambitions collided in North America, where borders were undefined and alliances uncertain. Indigenous nations held their own authority, navigating a precarious balance between competing empires. For Washington, still a youth, this environment offered both fascination and warning. The frontier revealed that civilization was fragile, dependent not on dominance, but on restraint. It was in this period that Washington came under the influence of the Fairfax family, among the most prominent in Virginia. Lord Thomas Fairfax, an English nobleman who owned vast tracts of land in the northern Shenandoah, recognized the young man's reliability and skill. Through this association, Washington gained entry into circles of wealth and learning otherwise closed to him. He learned the manners of the gentry, the etiquette of leadership, and the subtle politics of colonial society. Yet beneath this polish, his identity remained that of a man shaped by work and experience rather than privilege. By the age of 17, George Washington had already achieved a reputation as a competent surveyor and a young man of promise. His maps were prized for their accuracy. His conduct was measured, reserved, and dutiful. He had begun to assemble the habits that would define him: patience, discipline, and a reluctance to speak hastily. In him, the ideals of the Virginia gentleman met the endurance of the frontier, a combination that would prepare him for the unpredictable course of his later years. There is no record of great ambition in his youth, no letters filled with dreams of glory or conquest. What we find instead is steadiness, a sense that life's course should be measured, not seized. Yet within that restraint lay a quiet restlessness, a desire to prove that honour and competence could shape destiny, even in a world governed by birth and title. As he stood on the banks of the Potomac in his early manhood, George Washington could not have known that his own life would mirror the course of the nation itself, uncertain, turbulent, yet moving inevitably toward independence. In these early years, the qualities that would define him were already forming. He was learning to command without arrogance, to observe before acting, and to bear responsibility without complaint. In the wilderness and the drawing rooms of Virginia, a leader was being shaped, not through rebellion or passion, but through observation, endurance, and the quiet weight of duty. History's turning points often begin not with a declaration, but with preparation. The boy from Westmoreland County was preparing for a destiny neither he nor the world yet imagined. The young George Washington's years on the frontier formed both his character and his understanding of power. The Virginia of the 1750s was a colony standing at the edge of transformation, caught between loyalty to the British Crown and the realities of a new world taking shape beyond the Appalachian Mountains. As Washington matured into manhood, the calm and measured patterns of plantation life began to give way to uncertainty. Land, honour, and allegiance intertwined in ways that would test his judgment and endurance. By 21, he was no longer only a surveyor. He had become an ambitious provincial officer with the attention of men who held influence in the colony's government. Yet ambition for Washington was never ostentatious. It was quiet, deliberate, and bound by a code of service that he regarded as both moral and practical. His first call to public service came at a moment of rising tension between the British and French empires. Both powers claimed the Ohio Valley, a vast expanse stretching toward the Great Lakes, rich in resources and strategic value. To the colonial governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania, this territory represented expansion and defense. To the French, it was an essential link connecting Canada to Louisiana. To the native nations, the Iroquois, Delaware, and Shawnee, it was ancestral land, neither British nor French. The competing claims created a tinderbox, and in 1753, Governor Robert Dinwiddie sought to send an emissary to the French forts in the region to deliver a formal warning on behalf of the British Crown. The mission required a man of courage, diplomacy, and endurance. Washington, then just 21, volunteered. The journey into the Ohio Valley was treacherous, conducted in the depths of winter, through snow and dense forests. Washington led a small party of frontiersmen and native guides, among them the experienced Seneca leader Tanacharison, known to the English as the Half-King. The young emissary carried Dinwiddie's letter to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, demanding withdrawal from British-claimed territory. The encounter was civil but fruitless. The French politely refused and reinforced their positions. Yet Washington's conduct impressed his superiors. His journal, written in a clear and factual style, circulated widely in both the colonies and London, giving him a reputation for bravery and intelligence. It was the beginning of a public life that would place him at the centre of imperial conflict. Only months later, in 1754, Washington was dispatched once again into the Ohio Valley, this time with a small force of Virginia militia. His orders were to secure the forks of the Ohio, today's Pittsburgh, before the French could establish a fort there, but events moved swiftly. A French detachment under Ensign Jumonville was spotted nearby. Acting on uncertain intelligence and guided by his native allies, Washington led a dawn attack. The skirmish was brief, chaotic, and fatal. Jumonville was killed and his men captured. For Washington, it was a moment of youthful decision-making under extreme pressure. For the empires of Europe, it became the spark of a wider war. The French claimed Jumonville had been on a diplomatic mission, and the event was labelled an assassination. Washington, now suddenly a central figure in an international dispute, built a crude defensive post he called Fort Necessity. The name would prove prophetic. In July of that year, French forces retaliated, overwhelming his position. The battle was confused and brutal, fought under heavy rain that turned trenches into mud. Realizing resistance was futile, Washington signed articles of surrender, the only time he would do so in his military career. Unbeknownst to him, the document he signed, written in French, included an admission of guilt for Jumonville's death. When translated later, it embarrassed both Washington and the colonial authorities. Yet within this failure lay lessons that would define his future command: the value of caution, the importance of supply and preparation, and the understanding that discipline, not courage alone, determines survival. In defeat, Washington's reputation did not collapse. Rather, it evolved. He had shown composure, leadership, and a willingness to bear responsibility. In the colonies, where news travelled slowly and interpretations often softened with distance, he was seen as a brave officer who had stood firm against superior forces. He resigned his commission, reflecting quietly at Mount Vernon, but his name was now recognised beyond Virginia. Europe would soon descend into what history would call the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. The young man from the frontier would soon be called to service again. When British General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia in 1755 to lead a large expedition against the French, Washington volunteered as an aide-de-camp. He admired Braddock's discipline and professionalism, qualities that reflected the might of the British Army. Yet as the campaign advanced into the wilderness, Washington began to see the limits of European warfare in America's terrain. The march toward Fort Duquesne was slow, hampered by dense forests and narrow paths. The soldiers' bright uniforms and strict formations made them easy targets for hidden attackers. In July, the expedition met disaster at the Monongahela River. French and native forces ambushed Braddock's column. Confusion turned to chaos. Braddock was fatally wounded, and the British troops broke ranks in panic. Amid the devastation, Washington displayed remarkable steadiness. 2 horses were shot from under him. 4 bullets pierced his coat, yet he remained unscathed. Rallying the survivors, he organized a retreat that prevented complete annihilation. This composure under fire became legendary, and reports of his courage spread across the colonies. For Washington himself, it was another lesson in leadership under pressure and in the limits of rigid command. He learned that the American landscape required adaptability, not mere obedience to form. After Braddock's death, Washington was appointed commander of all Virginia forces, responsible for the defense of a frontier stretching hundreds of miles. The post demanded organization rather than glory. His army was small, poorly equipped, and often unpaid. Washington struggled to instill discipline among men more accustomed to farming than to formal drill. He faced continual shortages of supplies and the political interference of the colonial assembly. Yet he persevered. At Fort Loudoun in Winchester, he built a base of operations, training his men in order, routine, and respect. Through long months of hardship, he learned patience and restraint, qualities that would later prove essential. The years between 1756 and 1758 hardened him. He saw the cruelty of frontier warfare, the devastation of settlements, and the suffering of civilians caught between empires. When the British finally captured Fort Duquesne in 1758, Washington resigned once more. The war had given him a lifetime of experience, but also a deep awareness of limits, the limits of empire, of command, and of human endurance. He returned home weary but wiser, a soldier who had seen the edge of civilization and the cost of defending it. At Mount Vernon, he resumed civilian life, not yet knowing that the lessons learned in muddy trenches and burning forests would one day guide him through the founding of a nation. The discipline of the frontier, the humility of defeat, and the burden of responsibility had all prepared him for a destiny that was still decades away. For now, peace returned, and with it, the quiet rhythm of land and family. The soldier laid down his sword, but not his vigilance. History was not finished with him, nor he with history. The years that followed Washington's resignation from military service brought him into a different kind of battle, one of patience, responsibility, and the careful management of domestic life. At the age of 26, he returned to Mount Vernon, a modest estate overlooking the Potomac River. The war had hardened his sense of discipline, and now that discipline turned toward the quiet, relentless labour of shaping a life rooted in the soil. In 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow of social standing and refinement. Their union, though not driven by romantic passion, was built on mutual respect and affection. Martha brought stability, resources, and a household of considerable means. Washington, in turn, brought her steadfastness and order. Together, they began to cultivate not only the land, but a sense of permanence that had long eluded him during his years of military uncertainty. Mount Vernon became the axis of Washington's identity. The estate stretched over thousands of acres, a self-contained world of fields, workshops, and homes for the enslaved people whose labour sustained its prosperity. Washington rose before dawn, his day governed by method. He inspected the fields, reviewed accounts, wrote letters, and managed every detail of production. His journals reveal not grandeur, but precision, an endless calculation of yield, cost, and improvement. Tobacco was slowly replaced by wheat and other crops as he sought to make the plantation self-sufficient. The rhythm of his life seemed settled, yet beneath this surface of peace lay a restlessness of thought. He had witnessed the machinery of empire, the limitations of authority, and the dignity that self-government might one day offer. Those reflections matured silently as he worked the land, observing both the prosperity and the moral contradictions that surrounded him. Washington's domestic years also shaped his moral and civic sensibilities. He presided over a household filled with people whose lives were not their own, men and women enslaved by economic and legal institutions that underpinned Virginia's wealth. Though he rarely spoke openly of slavery during these years, his records show a growing unease with the system. He measured the output of human labour as meticulously as that of his crops, and in that process he confronted the inescapable tension between profit and humanity. The society he lived in did not question such contradictions. It was built upon them. Yet in his private reflections, the seeds of doubt began to take root. That moral disquiet would never become open rebellion against the institution, but in later years it would transform into a quiet act of conscience that stood apart from many of his contemporaries. In public life, Washington's reputation as a man of integrity brought him into the circles of Virginia's leadership. He served in the House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, where he learned the slow, deliberate art of debate and governance. He was not a man of eloquence. His speeches were brief, careful, and factual. But he listened intently, measured his words, and earned respect through his reserve. This was the period in which the colonies began to feel the first tremors of discontent with Britain. The cost of the 7 Years' War had burdened the empire, and new taxes were imposed on the colonies without their consent. The Stamp Act of 1765 struck at the heart of local autonomy, and resistance began to spread among merchants, farmers, and legislators alike. Washington, though not given to radical rhetoric, stood among those who believed that liberty was bound to property and self-rule. He joined his peers in condemning the taxes, supporting boycotts of British goods, and calling for unity among the colonies. Through the late 1760s and early 1770s, his views grew firmer, though always tempered by caution. He was neither a zealot nor a demagogue. His politics emerged from experience rather than theory. To him, governance was a practical arrangement of order and consent. What disturbed him most was not taxation itself, but the principle of authority imposed from afar. The same instincts that guided him on the frontier, the need for self-reliance and local judgment, now shaped his political conscience. In letters to friends and fellow planters, he wrote of frustration, yet always with a tone of restraint. "The crisis is now arrived," he once observed, "when we must assert our rights or submit to every imposition." His words carried no bitterness, only the calm precision of a man who had weighed his choices and recognized the gravity of defiance. While these political concerns deepened, Washington's private life continued with the same orderliness. He entertained visitors at Mount Vernon with quiet hospitality, preferring conversation about land, weather, and agriculture to the heated polemics of the time. His correspondence widened. He exchanged ideas with men who would soon become the architects of revolution. Jefferson, Mason, and Henry among them. Yet he remained a man of action more than of words. His estate became both refuge and observation post, from which he could witness the slow erosion of harmony between colony and crown. By 1774, the first open conflicts had begun to surface in Massachusetts, and the mood in Virginia shifted from protest to preparation. The call for unity was no longer rhetorical. It was a matter of survival. When the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, Washington was chosen as one of Virginia's delegates. He travelled north in his customary silence, wearing a plain uniform of colonial militia, a gesture both symbolic and practical. There, among merchants, lawyers, and planters, he spoke little but listened intently. The debates were long, filled with uncertainty and caution. Independence was not yet the goal. Reconciliation still seemed possible. But Washington sensed that compromise was giving way to inevitability. The colonies were drifting toward war, not through choice but through the slow accumulation of grievances that no proclamation could erase. When he returned to Virginia, he began to reorganize local militias, ensuring they were trained and supplied should conflict come. His actions were quiet, methodical, and purposeful, as if he were preparing not for glory, but for duty. As 1775 opened, the first shots at Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open resistance. The British Empire, once the object of colonial loyalty, had become the adversary. In that moment of confusion and rising fear, Washington's reputation for steadiness drew attention once more. When the Second Continental Congress assembled, he was again present, and this time the deliberations would shape the course of history. Amid the uncertainties of that gathering, as delegates argued over the form and future of their defence, one decision emerged that would define his life. On June 15, 1775, George Washington was unanimously appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He accepted the commission with humility, standing before Congress in his simple uniform, declaring that he did not seek salary beyond the reimbursement of expenses. His words reflected not modesty alone, but an understanding of the peril ahead. The task was immense: to unite a collection of militias, ill-equipped and untrained, against the most formidable military power in the world. Washington's expression remained calm, his bearing formal, his voice steady. Beneath that composure, he must have felt the full weight of uncertainty. Yet as he departed for Cambridge to assume command of the army besieging Boston, the transformation was complete. The surveyor had become a soldier, the planter a leader of men, the loyal subject a commander in rebellion. The journey from Mount Vernon to Cambridge marked more than distance. It was the crossing of a moral threshold. The ideals of order, duty, and restraint that had guided Washington's life were now being tested in the crucible of revolution. Behind him lay the world of private responsibility and personal discipline. Before him stretched the vast and uncharted experiment of national independence. As he rode north through the countryside, quiet villages saluted him, and farmers left their fields to watch his passage. They saw not yet a hero, but a man of measured confidence who carried in his silence the fragile hopes of a people discovering themselves. When Washington arrived in Cambridge in the summer of 1775, the air was thick with uncertainty and expectation. The makeshift army that awaited him was more a gathering of militias than a disciplined force. They were farmers, tradesmen, and artisans, drawn together by passion rather than by training, many lacking proper uniforms, weapons, or organisation. What they did possess was determination, a will to resist, even if that will had not yet been moulded into an army capable of facing the British Empire. Washington, surveying the ragged encampments that stretched across the hills overlooking Boston, understood immediately that his first battle would not be against the enemy, but against disorder. He moved through the ranks with calm authority, noting the conditions, the shortages, and the untested spirits of men who had answered a call to liberty, but had little notion of the discipline it demanded. The siege of Boston was his first command in the revolutionary cause, and it tested every facet of his leadership. He inherited an army of nearly 15,000 men, but supplies were scarce and morale fluctuated with rumour and hunger. Washington brought with him a soldier's precision, insisting on order, hygiene, and routine. He reorganised the ranks, imposed strict regulations, and sought to instil a sense of collective purpose. His demeanour remained reserved, his tone firm but never harsh. Those who served under him often remarked on his composure, his ability to command respect without raising his voice. The discipline that had sustained him through the wilderness of earlier wars now became the foundation upon which a nation's army would be built. Yet Washington's strength was not found solely in command. It was rooted in patience. The months dragged on with little action. The British held Boston behind their fortifications, supplied by the sea, while the Continental Army encircled them, waiting for an opportunity that seemed distant. Supplies ran low. Disease spread through the camps. The Commander-in-Chief faced pressure from Congress, from his officers, and from the restless spirit of a public eager for victory. But Washington refused to act rashly. He knew that a single disastrous engagement could destroy the cause before it had truly begun. Instead, he focused on preparation, drilling his men, and strengthening defences. In early 1776, a turning point came with the arrival of artillery captured from Fort Ticonderoga, laboriously transported across the winter landscape by Colonel Henry Knox. With these cannons, Washington seized the high ground at Dorchester Heights, positioning them in range of the British fleet. The move was decisive. Realising that Boston could no longer be held without catastrophic loss, the British evacuated the city in March. It was Washington's first victory, not through bloodshed, but through calculation and resolve. The triumph was quiet, disciplined, and without arrogance, yet it gave the colonies their first tangible hope that the rebellion could endure. His next challenge, however, would be far greater. The British soon redirected their efforts toward New York, a city of immense strategic value. There, They intended to crush the rebellion in a single stroke. Washington, aware of the danger, moved his forces to defend the city. But he was entering a new phase of war, one that would test not only his strategy, but his spirit. The summer of 1776 brought a series of calamities. The British fleet arrived in overwhelming strength, its sails filling the harbour with a vision of imperial power that dwarfed the fragile hopes of the new army. Washington's troops, untested and often ill-prepared, faced seasoned professionals commanded by generals of long experience. The battles for New York unfolded in a series of retreats. At Long Island, his forces were outmanoeuvred and forced to withdraw under cover of darkness. Brooklyn Heights, Kips Bay, Harlem, White Plains, each engagement tested the limits of his endurance. The defeats came in succession, but they did not break him. Through these dark months, Washington revealed the quality that would define him more than any battlefield triumph: resilience. When lesser men might have sought refuge in despair, he maintained composure. His army was not destroyed because he refused to allow panic to consume it. Each retreat was orderly, calculated to preserve what remained for another day. In these moments, the image of Washington as an unshakable leader began to take shape. The year 1776 closed in near ruin. The army was dwindling, enlistments expiring, morale collapsing. The cause itself seemed near extinction. The British occupied New York and Congress fled south. The dream of liberty was fading into the winter cold. Washington faced an impossible choice: to hold what little ground remained and risk disintegration, or to strike boldly and restore confidence. He chose action, guided by instinct and necessity. On the night of December 25, 1776, he led his men across the icy Delaware River, a manoeuvre of extraordinary courage and precision. The crossing was perilous. Freezing winds lashed the boats, and sheets of ice clogged the water. Yet Washington pressed forward, standing silently in his greatcoat as his soldiers rode through the darkness. By dawn, the army reached the opposite shore and advanced on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The attack was swift and complete. The victory was small in scale, but immense in meaning. It restored faith, not only in Washington's command, but in the cause itself. A week later, he struck again at Princeton, defeating British forces and securing a foothold in New Jersey. These actions transformed the Revolution from a fading rebellion into a renewed struggle. They also revealed Washington's mastery of timing, the ability to seize opportunity when all else seemed lost. Still, the war dragged on, uncertain and costly. Through 1777, the British focused their campaign on Philadelphia, the seat of Congress. Washington's army met them at Brandywine and Germantown, but failed to halt their advance. The capital fell, and winter descended once more. The commander led his troops to Valley Forge, a remote encampment that would become a symbol of endurance. The winter of 1777-1778 was among the harshest in memory. Men lacked shoes, blankets, and food. Disease spread. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Yet in this crucible, the Continental Army was transformed. Under the training of the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben, Washington's men learned discipline, drill, and the cohesion of professional soldiers. Washington himself shared their suffering, He rode among the huts daily, speaking little, observing much. His presence carried weight more than any proclamation could. He was no longer merely a general. He was the embodiment of perseverance. Those who saw him in those months often described his silence as the strongest form of leadership. He did not promise victory. He promised endurance. When spring came, his army emerged lean, disciplined, and united. They had survived not by chance, but by the moral force he had instilled in them. The following years would bring alliances, intrigues, and slow progress toward victory. The entry of France into the war changed its nature entirely, transforming a colonial uprising into a global conflict. Washington, always cautious, balanced gratitude with prudence, aware that foreign aid, though essential, brought new complexities. Within his own ranks, rivalries and political interference persisted, but he endured them as he endured every challenge, with patience and dignity. The lessons of defeat had taught him that the path to victory was seldom direct. By 1781, the war reached its climax. With French naval support and careful coordination, Washington moved his forces south to trap the British Army under General Cornwallis at Yorktown. The siege was systematic, deliberate, and precise. When Cornwallis finally surrendered, Washington did not exult. He received the news with quiet satisfaction, fully aware that the work of building peace would soon prove as demanding as that of waging war. For the first time in 8 years, the guns fell silent. The colonies were free, though their future remained uncertain. As he stood before his troops after the victory, Washington's expression betrayed no triumph, only relief. He thanked his men for their service and reminded them that liberty must be guarded not by the sword, but by character. His revolution had never been for conquest. It had been for endurance, for the right of a people to govern themselves with dignity. The young surveyor who had once measured the wilderness now measured something far greater, the moral distance between subjection and self-rule. When the war ended, the silence that followed the guns was uneasy. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 did not immediately bring peace, only exhaustion and uncertainty. Washington's army, though triumphant, remained unpaid and restless, and the fragile alliance that had sustained the rebellion began to strain under the weight of independence. The British still occupied key posts, the treasury was empty, and the new nation, though victorious in war, had not yet learned the discipline of peace. For Washington, the challenge now was no longer the enemy before him, but the disunity behind him. His headquarters at Newburgh on the Hudson became the centre of tension. Rumours spread that the officers, frustrated by Congress's inability to meet their obligations, were considering action, a mutiny that might place the army against the very government it had served to create. In those critical weeks of 1783, Washington's leadership took on a moral dimension that would define his place in history. When he entered the assembly of officers to address their grievances, the mood was bitter. He spoke slowly, without flourish, acknowledging their sacrifices and hardships. Then, reaching into his pocket to read a letter from Congress, he hesitated, removing his spectacles. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown grey, but almost blind in the service of my country." The words, unplanned and plain, broke the tension. The officers, moved by the sight of their commander's humility, wept. In that moment, authority passed not through power, but through respect. The mutiny dissolved. The army, bound by the moral weight of Washington's character, returned to order. Months later, when the final peace treaty was signed in Paris, Washington faced one last act of duty. On December 23, 1783, in the Hall of Congress at Annapolis, he rose to resign his commission as Commander-in-Chief. The gesture astonished the world. In an age when victors became rulers, he relinquished authority without hesitation. His address was brief, dignified, and without self-congratulation. He thanked Congress for its confidence and his soldiers for their devotion. Then, bowing slightly, he turned and walked away. The moment symbolized the birth of a republic, founded not on the force of arms, but on the principle of civic virtue. King George III, upon hearing of the resignation, is said to have remarked, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Returning to Mount Vernon, Washington sought only peace. The years of war had aged him. His once vigorous frame now carried the quiet gravity of responsibility fulfilled. Yet the land awaited his attention, and he turned again to the steady labour of management, improvement, and correspondence. He wrote often to his comrades and to leaders of the states, urging unity and order. The nation, free but fragile, drifted under the weak Articles of Confederation. Commerce faltered, debts mounted, and rivalries grew between states. Washington, observing these developments, worried that the independence won at such cost might dissolve into chaos. He did not seek a role in public life again, yet he could not ignore the slow unravelling of the Union he had fought to preserve. By the mid-1780s, voices calling for reform began to gather strength. The Constitutional Convention was proposed as a means to repair the system, and though Washington hesitated, his presence was soon deemed essential. He was reluctant to accept, wary of returning to public service and of seeming ambitious for power. But duty prevailed once more. In May 1787, he travelled to Philadelphia, where delegates from 12 states met in secrecy to draft a new framework of government. His election as presiding officer of the convention was unanimous, and his conduct throughout the proceedings was characteristic, measured, impartial, and restrained. He spoke little, yet his mere presence imposed discipline and calm. The debates were long and often divisive, but under his steady guidance, compromise emerged. When the Constitution was finally completed, Washington viewed it neither as perfection nor as experiment alone, but as necessity, a structure born of circumstance and human limitation. He believed in the balance it sought between liberty and order, and though he feared its fragility, he lent it the force of his approval. His support carried immense weight. The people trusted his judgment, and his endorsement helped secure ratification. Yet as the new government took shape, the question arose again: who would lead it? The answer seemed inevitable. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States. He accepted the office reluctantly, writing that he felt like a culprit going to the place of his execution. The burden of expectation was immense. No precedent existed for his role. Every gesture would set an example for generations. When he took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York, the crowd below fell silent. He placed his hand upon the Bible, recited the oath in a voice firm but subdued, and added, "So help me God." The Republic had its first leader, not a monarch, not a conqueror, but a citizen elevated by trust. The early years of his presidency were years of construction. Washington and his advisers, men such as Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Henry Knox, faced the task of transforming the abstract framework of the Constitution into a functioning government. Departments were formed, finances organized, and the judiciary established. Washington sought balance in all things, aware that every decision carried symbolic meaning. He conducted himself with dignity, conscious that the young republic required decorum to command respect at home and abroad. His weekly levees were formal, yet devoid of pomp. His bearing remained austere. To those who sought favour or factional advantage, he offered patience, but little indulgence. The challenges of leadership were constant. Factional divisions deepened between Federalists and Republicans, between visions of a centralized authority and local autonomy. Washington, standing above these disputes, tried to maintain neutrality, though his sympathy lay with the need for order and stability. Hamilton's financial reforms strengthened the nation's credit, but stirred resentment among those who feared encroachment of federal power. Jefferson, his Secretary of State, grew increasingly critical. Washington listened to both, but his decisions remained guided by prudence rather than passion. He saw politics not as a struggle for dominance, but as the delicate balance between reason and restraint. Beyond domestic affairs, foreign pressures tested the Republic's endurance. The wars of Europe threatened to draw the new nation into old conflicts. When revolutionary France called for support against Britain, Washington issued his Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, declaring that the United States would remain impartial. It was a decision of necessity, preserving the fragile peace needed for national growth, The criticism was immediate and severe, yet Washington bore it with the same patience that had carried him through war. To him, the preservation of unity was worth the cost of misunderstanding. As his second term drew to a close, he resolved to withdraw. In his farewell address, published in 1796, he offered his final counsel to the nation. He warned against the dangers of faction, the corruption of foreign influence, and the abandonment of moral principle. The document, written with care and restraint, reflected not the ambition of a ruler, but the wisdom of experience. The name of American, he wrote, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. It was both guidance and farewell, an appeal to virtue as the foundation of liberty. When he left the presidency, the people mourned his departure. Processions accompanied him as he travelled home, yet he sought no ceremony. At Mount Vernon once more, he resumed the quiet rhythm of estate life. He walked his fields, corresponded with friends, and attended to improvements with the same precision as before. The years had brought fame, yet fame had not altered him. Those who visited found him reserved but cordial, his manner unchanged. He spoke little of politics, preferring to discuss agriculture and the weather. His life had come full circle, from the solitude of youth to the solitude of retirement, linked by duty at every stage. In the winter of 1799, a sudden illness struck. After riding in cold rain, he developed a severe throat infection that worsened rapidly. Physicians were summoned, applying the treatments of the time, bloodletting, poultices and tinctures. But nothing eased his suffering. Washington faced his end with composure, giving instructions for his estate and the freedom of his enslaved workers upon Martha's death. On the night of December 14th, he whispered, "It is well." The room fell silent as the man who had led a revolution and refused a crown passed into history. News of his death spread slowly, but struck deeply. Across the nation, bells tolled, sermons were delivered, and black drapery hung from public buildings. In cities and small towns alike, people gathered to mourn not only a leader, but an example. He had lived through the contradictions of his age, aristocrat and republican, soldier and peacekeeper, slaveholder and advocate of liberty. And yet his life stood as proof that virtue could govern power. The republic he had guided was still young, its future uncertain, but his legacy endured as its measure. At Mount Vernon, the Potomac flowed quietly beneath winter skies. Martha Washington withdrew into private mourning, the great house subdued in tone and sound. Outside, the fields lay bare, awaiting spring. The world beyond continued to change, but his image remained, serene, grave, and enduring. With his passing, a chapter of history closed, but the principle he embodied remained alive, that freedom, to endure, must rest on character, patience, and restraint. The general had become the nation, and the nation, in remembering him, continued to define itself by the measure of his example. After Washington's death, the new nation entered a period of reflection unlike any it had known. In the weeks that followed December 1799, the American people seemed to pause in collective stillness. The man who had been both symbol and substance of their independence was gone, and the void he left was profound. The news travelled slowly across the states by riders and printed sheets, yet everywhere it arrived, it carried the same stunned gravity. Church bells rang, minute guns fired along riverbanks, and in every town, gatherings formed to honour his memory. In Philadelphia, where Congress sat in temporary quarters, men wore black armbands, and Henry Lee delivered the official eulogy, naming him first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Those words, formal and restrained, captured a sentiment that reached far beyond the ceremony itself. For Americans of every region and station, Washington had represented something enduring, a visible standard of moral strength and moderation in a world still uncertain of republican virtue. As the 19th century began, Washington's memory transformed gradually from that of a man into that of an emblem. His image appeared in paintings, pamphlets and prints, not as a warrior in triumph, but as a calm and reflective patriarch. Artists sought to portray him in moments of contemplation rather than action, at Valley Forge, at the head of the army, or in quiet retirement at Mount Vernon. Each depiction softened the human features of fatigue and doubt, replacing them with the serenity of ideal character. The Washington of history had been deliberate, sometimes stern, often cautious. The Washington of memory became flawless, his reserve interpreted as wisdom, his restraint as moral perfection. This transformation was neither deliberate deceit nor myth for its own sake. It was the natural work of a people seeking stability in the image of their beginning. The new republic, still fragile, needed its founder not merely as a precedent, but as a constant reminder of unity. Mount Vernon itself became a site of quiet pilgrimage. Visitors came by boat or carriage, sometimes unannounced, to walk the paths he had once walked. The estate remained in family hands, preserved as he had left it, the rhythm of its fields continuing under the management of heirs and caretakers. Martha Washington lived only a few years longer, withdrawing from public life in solemn dignity. Before her death, she burned much of their personal correspondence, protecting what she considered private from the curiosity of history. What survived was fragmentary, brief notes of affection, concise instructions, and glimpses of domestic partnership built upon mutual respect. Their marriage, restrained and practical, reflected the tone of the age, a union of shared duty rather than romantic display. Through the decades that followed, the United States grew in size and complexity. New generations, removed from the immediacy of the Revolution, encountered Washington not as a memory, but as a symbol inscribed in textbooks, speeches, and civic rituals. His birthday became an occasion for public reflection. His farewell address was read aloud in the halls of Congress. The reverence that surrounded his name was at once genuine and instructive, a means of teaching virtue through example. Yet beneath the veneration lay an evolving understanding of what his life had meant. The expansion of the frontier, the rise of industry, and the conflicts over slavery and states' rights all invited reinterpretation of his legacy. For some, he was the embodiment of national unity. For others, a reminder of contradictions unresolved at the nation's birth. In Europe, too, his reputation endured as a rare example of power restrained. Philosophers and statesmen cited him as proof that republican government could exist without anarchy. Napoleon Bonaparte, in his early years, spoke admiringly of Washington's moderation, contrasting it with the excesses of the French Revolution. Writers like Chateaubriand and Byron referred to him as the model of civic virtue, the soldier who conquered not to rule, but to relinquish. Across oceans, his name became synonymous with integrity in leadership. Yet this idealization, while honoring his restraint, often overlooked the human doubts and contradictions that had shaped his decisions. The Washington of global imagination stood apart from time, a figure carved in clarity, untroubled by compromise. The reality had been more complex, a man who navigated imperfection with care rather than certainty. As the 19th century advanced, monuments began to rise. The most ambitious was the Washington Monument in the capital city that bore his name. Planned soon after his death, but delayed for decades by war, politics, and scarcity of funds, it finally took form as a tall, austere obelisk, simple in design, monumental in presence. Its construction spanned generations, reflecting both persistence and division. When completed in 1884, it stood not merely as tribute, but as statement, that the Republic, despite all its trials, still sought its measure in the restraint and balance of its first leader. The monument's stark lines echoed his character, unadorned, upright, without excess. Throughout these years of remembrance, historians and citizens alike grappled with the paradoxes that defined him. He had fought for liberty while maintaining a system of bondage within his own household. He had embodied equality before the law while presiding over a society stratified by wealth and status. His letters reveal a man aware of these contradictions, yet uncertain how to reconcile them. In later life, he expressed private regret and arranged for the emancipation of his enslaved workers after his death, a decision rare among his contemporaries. That act, though quiet, signalled an acknowledgement of the moral tension within the Republic's founding. In it lay both the limitation of his age and the beginning of the nation's long struggle toward coherence between its principles and its practices. By the early 20th century, Washington's image had entered the realm of national mythology. His likeness appeared on currency, his name on towns, counties, and schools. Children learned stories of his honesty and courage, some factual, others invented for instruction. The myth of the cherry tree, created by Parson Weems, endured as a parable of integrity, simplifying character into lesson. It was an invention, yet one that spoke to a truth the people wished to preserve, that leadership required honesty grounded in humility. Through myth and history alike, Washington remained the constant point against which the nation measured its conscience. In quieter academic circles, historians began to re-examine him not as legend, but as human being. They studied his correspondence, his ledgers, his military dispatches, revealing a mind precise and methodical, a temperament cautious yet resolute. The Washington that emerged from these records was not the marble figure of monument or painting, but a man of calculation, uncertainty, and evolving conviction. His greatness lay not in absence of doubt, but in mastery of it. He governed his impulses as he governed his army, by discipline and reason. In an age of rhetoric, he spoke sparingly. In a world of ambition, he relinquished power. These qualities, simple yet rare, became the moral currency of his reputation. As centuries turned, the meaning of his example adapted to each generation's needs. In times of crisis, Americans looked to his steadiness. In times of prosperity, to his restraint. The principles he embodied, duty, moderation, endurance, remained relevant even as the nation he founded grew far beyond anything he could have imagined. The questions he left behind, however, remained open. Can a people remain virtuous amid abundance? Can freedom survive ambition? Washington himself never presumed to answer. He believed only that the strength of a republic must come from the character of its citizens. Today, his presence endures not through grand declarations, but through quiet permanence, the capital that bears his name, the river he once crossed in defiance, the estate that still overlooks the Potomac. In those places, time seems to slow, and the distance between past and present narrows. The figure of Washington stands not as conqueror or saint, but as reminder. He lived in a world of contradiction and compromise, yet his life traced a steady course toward principle. His greatness was not of spectacle, but of silence, the strength to endure, to act with restraint, and to leave power willingly behind. The story of George Washington closes as it began, with a question that remains its own answer. Can virtue build a nation where kings once ruled? The experiment he began continues still, tested in every generation. The man is gone, but the measure endures, an unfinished ideal carried forward in the unending work of freedom itself. In the decades following the close of the 18th century, the image of George Washington became inseparable from the identity of the United States itself. His life had ended, yet his presence grew more encompassing with each passing generation. What had once been the story of a man became the moral architecture of a nation still discovering its shape. In the early republic, every argument about law, leadership, and liberty eventually returned to him. Politicians invoked his name as if it carried constitutional weight, and citizens, still uncertain of what it meant to live without a monarch, looked to his example as a substitute for permanence. The authority he had once carried in person now resided in the memory of his character, a silent measure by which men judge themselves. As the 19th century advanced and the country expanded beyond the Appalachian Mountains, Washington's figure remained fixed at the centre of the national consciousness. His restraint, once seen as modesty, now appeared as prophecy. In a time of rapid growth, speculation, and political fervour, he seemed to represent a lost simplicity, a moral stillness that new generations longed to reclaim. Speeches commemorating his birthday were delivered in schoolhouses and public squares. His image appeared in civic halls and churches alike. The people spoke of him not in the language of ambition, but of reverence. He was called the Father of his country, a title that blended affection with discipline, suggesting that freedom, like a family, required guidance. Yet this reverence, as steady as it appeared, also reflected an unease, the recognition that the ideals he embodied were already being tested by the realities of power, commerce, and division. By the mid-19th century, the contradictions within Washington's legacy became unavoidable. The Union he had laboured to unite was beginning to fracture under the strain of moral and economic conflict. The issue of slavery, which had remained unresolved in his own lifetime, returned with new force. Both North and South claimed his memory as their own. In the Southern states, his image was used to defend tradition and hierarchy. In the North, he was celebrated as the champion of liberty, whose example condemned the bondage still practiced below the Mason-Dixon line. That both sides could look to the same figure for justification revealed the depth of his symbolic power and the complexity of the nation he had founded. His words were reinterpreted, his actions scrutinized, his silence filled with meanings he might never have intended. Yet in every interpretation there remained respect for the equilibrium of his character, the belief that he had governed himself as carefully as he had governed others. During the Civil War, the image of Washington took on renewed importance. For Abraham Lincoln, he represented both inspiration and warning. Lincoln often spoke of the founders as men who had built a framework that later generations must preserve, not abandon. In his speeches, Washington's example served as the moral thread connecting the birth of independence to the preservation of union. Soldiers in blue and grey carried images of Washington in their pockets, invoking him as a symbol of courage and legitimacy, each believing they fought for the continuation of his vision. When the war ended, the nation emerged changed in structure, but still seeking moral continuity. The Washington Monument, finally completed 2 decades later, stood as a silent testament to endurance amid upheaval. Its marble surface bore no inscription of triumph, only the quiet assertion of presence, a single line ascending into sky, steady and unadorned. In the years that followed, the Industrial Revolution transformed the United States. Cities rose, machines reshaped labour, and immigration filled the land with voices and languages unknown to the generation of the founders. Amid the noise of progress, Washington's memory remained a kind of still point. Educators presented him as the embodiment of civic virtue. Reformers cited his self-restraint as the antidote to corruption and excess. His farewell address, once a document of practical advice, was recited as scripture. Even as the nation's identity grew more complex, his remained simple by design, a fixed reference in a world of motion. Yet beneath that simplicity lay tension. The myth of Washington had grown so luminous that the man himself began to disappear from view. The realities of his era, the limits of his vision, the contradictions of his social world, were softened into abstraction. He became the symbol of what the Republic wished to remember about itself, not necessarily what it had been. During the 20th century, With the rise of global wars and modern leadership, Washington's example once again found new relevance. In an age defined by speed, power, and ideology, his calm restraint seemed almost foreign, yet deeply necessary. Presidents studied his precedents, the voluntary relinquishing of power, the insistence on civilian authority over the military, the understanding that the stability of a republic depends not on the brilliance of individuals, but on the discipline of institutions. When crises came, economic collapse, war, and social unrest, statesmen invoked his memory as a reminder that endurance was the truest measure of strength. Monuments to him stood not only in Washington, D.C., but in distant capitals, where his name symbolized the possibility of governance without tyranny. At the same time, scholars began to revisit his humanity with new depth and candor. They examined his writings, not for legend, but for insight into a mind shaped by the tensions of duty and circumstance. His journals revealed a man often uncertain, sometimes frustrated, but guided by a persistent belief that honor was the foundation of liberty. His letters to friends and subordinates showed not aloofness, but empathy, expressed through precision. He was not born wise, he became so through effort. The perfection that later generations attributed to him was the product of discipline, not divinity. That understanding restored a certain dignity to his legacy, not the dignity of infallibility, but of perseverance within imperfection. In more recent years, reflection upon Washington's life has continued to evolve. The moral complexities of his age are now examined with honesty rather than reverence alone. His participation in slavery is acknowledged not to diminish his achievements, but to confront the full reality of the nation's origins. To see him clearly is to see the Republic clearly, conceived in aspiration, compromised in practice, and always striving toward reconciliation between its ideals and its actions. The fact that Washington himself sensed this tension and acted in the end to mitigate it marks the beginning of a long national self-examination. His will, freeing those enslaved at Mount Vernon after his death, stands as a final act of conscience, a small gesture in scope, yet vast in meaning, reflecting the evolution of a man aware of the unfinished nature of his country's promise. What remains today is not simply the story of George Washington, but the echo of his example. In the stillness of his portrait, in the measured words of his letters, and in the solemn lines of his monument, the same idea endures, that freedom requires restraint, and that true strength lies not in the pursuit of power, but in the willingness to relinquish it. Nations, like men, are tested less by triumph than by the discipline to preserve what triumph makes possible. Washington's life, traced from the quiet fields of Virginia to the founding of a republic, continues to remind those who inherit his experiment that character is the only foundation upon which liberty can endure. And so, his story concludes not with finality, but with continuity. The rivers he once surveyed still flow past Mount Vernon. The city that bears his name still governs a vast and restless nation, and his figure remains at the heart of its conscience. The general who became a citizen, the leader who became a symbol, the man who became a nation, his journey endures as both history and instruction. Time has tested his example and found it unfinished, as all human endeavours are. Yet within that incompleteness lies its strength, for the republic he founded was never meant to rest upon certainty, but upon the continual renewal of duty. As long as that idea survives, so too does the quiet presence of George Washington, an enduring reminder that freedom's greatest triumph is the restraint with which it governs itself. Across the 2 centuries that followed his death, George Washington's image travelled far beyond the borders of the nation he helped to create. His likeness, once known to only a few thousand colonial subjects, became a universal emblem of Republican dignity. Engraved on currency, cast in bronze and woven into the civic rituals of countless communities, his presence persisted wherever the idea of self-government sought expression. To many observers abroad, he embodied not only American independence, but the larger human aspiration toward just authority. For monarchs, he was the example of a leader who refused a crown. For revolutionaries, he was the measure of moderation amid change. No single nation could fully claim him, for his virtues belonged to no single people. His calm endurance, his refusal of power, and his belief in the tempering influence of law stood as moral constants in an age defined by upheaval. Within the United States, each generation reimagined Washington according to its own needs. In the era of expansion westward, he was celebrated as the steadfast pioneer of order, guiding civilization into untamed lands. During the turmoil of civil conflict, he became a symbol of unity, invoked by both North and South as the guardian of their respective ideals. In the industrial age, he represented honesty amid ambition, the virtue of simplicity within growing complexity. By the time of the modern era, his figure had come to occupy a space both intimate and distant, a man whose humanity was increasingly studied, yet whose symbolism remained untouchable. Even as scholarship grew more rigorous, peeling away layers of legend to reveal a man bound by the contradictions of his century, reverence for him endured. His image persisted not through perfection, but through continuity. He remained a point of moral orientation in the restless geography of national identity. The city that bears his name evolved into a living monument, its avenues, monuments, and domes arranged as if to express the symmetry he had valued in governance. The Washington Monument, rising in solitary height from the Mall, became less a memorial to conquest than to proportion. Its simplicity invited reflection rather than awe, reminding visitors that greatness need not announce itself with grandeur. Nearby, institutions of governance echoed the restraint that marked his leadership, the deliberate balance between power and principle, between deliberation and decision. Every inauguration held there, every oath taken beneath the winter sky, carried traces of his first cautious ceremony in 1789. To take public office in the United States was, implicitly, to follow the example he had set, to accept authority as duty, and to surrender it with humility. Yet history, as it lengthens, complicates its figures. The veneration of Washington has never been static. Each century, in its own way, has confronted the distance between the ideal he represents and the reality of his time. The modern examination of his life no longer rests on reverence alone. Scholars, historians, and citizens alike have sought to understand him as a man shaped by the contradictions of a colonial world, an aristocrat in a democratic revolution, a champion of liberty who presided over slavery. These inquiries, far from diminishing him, have deepened the respect owed to his honesty and his growth. He lived in an age when moral clarity was seldom absolute, yet within that context he moved gradually toward conscience. His final act, freeing the enslaved workers of Mount Vernon in his will, did not erase the injustices of his time, but revealed a man aware of their weight. His recognition of that burden was, perhaps, his last lesson to the nation, that virtue is not purity, but the continual striving for justice within imperfection. Even today, visitors to Mount Vernon encounter the quiet evidence of that struggle. The house stands much as it did in his lifetime, its white facade overlooking the river that once carried his goods to market. The surrounding fields are tended much as they were when he walked them at dawn, measuring distance and yield with the same precision he once applied to military lines. In the stillness of the estate, history feels close enough to touch. The visitor sees not only the general and the president, but the farmer, the husband, and the cautious thinker who sought order in all things. His study remains lined with the maps that defined his early career, his writing desk bears the simple tools with which he composed letters that shaped the course of nations. Standing in that room, one senses not majesty, but concentration, the quiet determination of a man who believed that discipline, once learned, could govern both a household and a republic. The persistence of Washington's influence lies in this combination of grandeur and restraint. He is admired not for the magnitude of his conquests, but for the control he exercised over them. Unlike many founders of states, he left no lineage of power, no dynasty, no personal monument to vanity. His legacy exists in the very absence of possession. He held power as one holds a trust, temporary and conditional, to be relinquished when duty is done. In that act of surrender, the return of his commission to Congress, the refusal of a third presidential term, he established a tradition more enduring than any law. The voluntary limitation of authority became the unwritten foundation of the American political order. Each peaceful transition that followed, each leader who stepped down at the appointed time, was an echo of that single gesture of restraint. Over time, the meaning of Washington's life has expanded beyond the boundaries of national history into a meditation on human nature itself. His story illustrates that leadership depends less on genius than on character, less on inspiration than on endurance. The man who guided his country through rebellion and nationhood did so not through visionary brilliance, but through a sustained balance between reason and emotion. His greatness was cumulative, a product of constancy rather than intensity. In this way, he became a model not only for presidents and generals, but for citizens. The republic he founded was conceived as a system in which every individual might share, in measure, the discipline that had defined his own conduct. His example reminds that freedom is not the absence of restraint, but its conscious acceptance for the common good. In the quiet light of dawn over the Potomac, it is possible to imagine him still present, the figure of a man standing at the threshold of history, his gaze directed toward a horizon he would not live to see. The river flows as it did in his time, steady and indifferent, reflecting the passing of generations that have continued the experiment he began. The questions that shaped his life remain unresolved. How long can a people preserve liberty without discipline? How can principle endure amid prosperity and change? These questions, unanswered yet ever relevant, are the true inheritance he left behind, and so the narrative circles back to its beginning. George Washington remains less a conclusion than a point of origin, the steady axis around which the Republic continues to turn. His life, measured by duty and tempered by reflection, offers not finality, but guidance. The years have not diminished his stature, they have clarified it. Beneath the marble and myth, the enduring truth persists, that the strength of a nation lies not in its armies or wealth, but in the restraint and character of those who lead it. As long as that understanding survives, the general who became a nation remains alive within its conscience, an enduring reminder that greatness is not declared but demonstrated quietly, through the disciplined labour of a lifetime. The dawn of the 19th century marked a period when George Washington's memory began to merge with the identity of the new republic. The generation that had known him personally was fading, and in their absence, the younger nation began to imagine him not only as the architect of its creation, but as the embodiment of its moral core. He was no longer the living figure whose judgment could be sought, but a presence of conscience against which all public life would be measured. Artists, writers, and statesmen looked to him as both symbol and standard. His silence, once the mark of temperament, now came to represent wisdom beyond speech. The stillness of his portrait became the stillness of the nation itself, a form of endurance made visible. In those early decades, the United States was fragile, its unity untested, its ambitions uncertain. The Constitution he had helped bring to life was a delicate structure dependent as much on trust as on law. Washington's example, therefore, was invoked not only in admiration, but in necessity. His words and gestures were cited in every debate over the meaning of government, from the role of the presidency to the boundaries of federal power. He had established precedents through his conduct, not his proclamations, and this very restraint made him both usable and unreachable. He belonged to no party, and for that reason all parties claimed him. Federalists saw in him the model of central authority tempered by virtue. Republicans found in his simplicity the ideal of civic humility. His figure hovered above political conflict, a reminder of a balance the living world struggled to preserve. As the years passed, the memory of his personal character began to harden into national ritual. His birthday became an occasion for reflection, marked by speeches, parades, and church services. School children recited his words, often simplified into lessons of honesty and duty. In homes across the country, small portraits of him hung beside family Bibles, the two together forming a moral pair, religion and republic intertwined. Such veneration was not mere idolatry, it was a form of reassurance. In a world of change and expansion, his image offered stability. The America that moved westward, carving fields from wilderness and establishing towns where no map had guided before, carried his name as a talisman. Counties, rivers, and settlements bore it in gratitude and imitation, as if to say that the nation's growth would remain anchored in the virtue of its origin. Yet beneath this calm reverence, new tensions were forming. The economic and social transformations of the early republic began to divide the country into distinct regions: industrial north, agrarian south, and frontier west. The unity that Washington had once personified was increasingly tested by differences of interest and ideology. Each side continued to invoke his example, but the meanings they drew from it diverged. To some, he was the champion of national strength; to others, the defender of local freedom. His warnings against faction and foreign entanglement were quoted by all and obeyed by none. The further the nation moved from his time, the more it needed to imagine his voice guiding it back to moderation. By mid-century, as the shadow of sectional conflict grew, Washington's presence took on the air of prophecy. In speeches delivered from pulpits and in legislatures, orators quoted his farewell address as if it were scripture. They spoke of him not simply as the founder of a state, but as the moral compass of a divided people. His call for unity was recited in tones of both reverence and regret, for by then the rift between North and South was too deep for memory alone to heal. When the Civil War finally erupted, both sides claimed his inheritance. The Union celebrated him as the father of national integrity. The Confederacy honored him as the Virginian who had once resisted a distant government. His image appeared on banners, coins, and regimental flags, sanctified by opposing causes. In this paradox, the depth of his influence was revealed. His life had become so fundamental to the nation's consciousness that even its division could not exclude him. When the war ended and the fields of battle grew silent, Washington's legacy resumed its unifying role. The exhausted country, seeking reconciliation, turned again to his memory as the only figure large enough to contain its conflicting truths. Monuments were erected, not as assertions of triumph, but as acts of healing. The completion of the Washington Monument, delayed through decades of turmoil, became a collective gesture of renewal. Its stark geometric simplicity seemed almost ascetic, a column of light against the sky. In its shadow, Americans could remember not the violence of their recent past, but the steadiness that had first given them direction. The monument's very restraint mirrored the character it honored, dignified, unadorned, and elevated not by ornament, but by proportion. As the 20th century unfolded, the world that Washington had known became almost unrecognizable. Industrialization transformed the landscape. Cities rose in steel and stone, and the United States, once a fragile experiment, emerged as a power whose reach extended far beyond its borders. Yet even as the nation grew in complexity, Washington's figure endured as a moral counterweight to the velocity of change. In the turmoil of modern life, he stood for simplicity. In the noise of political contention, for calm deliberation. His face, engraved on currency, served as a quiet symbol of permanence amid flux. Schools continued to teach his story, not only for history's sake, but as an ethical parable. The legend of his honesty, though apocryphal in detail, remained a fixture of education, a reminder that truthfulness was the first discipline of freedom. In times of national trial, leaders continued to look to him for legitimacy. During the world wars of the 20th century, his name was invoked in speeches that sought to link contemporary sacrifice to the endurance of the founding generation. The moral gravity of his example extended beyond politics into the realm of collective identity. He represented a type of leadership that measured its worth not by conquest, but by constancy, a leadership that saw restraint as the highest expression of strength. This vision resonated in moments when the Republic faced its own excesses and divisions. To recall Washington was to recall equilibrium, the calm at the center of movement, the principle of order amid expansion. Over time, however, the simplicity of his image began to invite deeper scrutiny. Modern historians, seeking to reconcile myth with evidence, examined his life in its full complexity. They found a man of contradictions, shaped as much by the limitations of his century as by his moral aspirations. He was neither saint nor statue, but a figure of discipline and doubt. He sought freedom within a society dependent on unfreedom, unity within a nation divided by region and interest. His silence, once praised as wisdom, sometimes concealed uncertainty. Yet it was precisely this humanity, this struggle between principle and circumstance, that made his endurance meaningful. His greatness, viewed through modern eyes, was not in transcending conflict, but in holding to virtue within it. Today, more than 200 years after his death, George Washington remains less a relic than a mirror. His story reflects what the nation wishes to see in itself: discipline, perseverance, and humility before responsibility. But it also reflects what it must continually confront: the distance between its ideals and its actions, between its founding vision and its lived reality. The continued relevance of his life lies in its incompleteness. He did not resolve the contradictions of liberty and inequality, unity and diversity, power and restraint. He merely framed them in a way that compelled future generations to continue the work. Each era has answered those questions differently, and in that evolving dialogue, his presence endures. At Mount Vernon, where his remains rest overlooking the river, the scene remains unchanged. The air is still, the landscape broad, the house quiet under the shifting light of seasons. Visitors approach in silence, as if entering a sanctuary. The place does not glorify victory, it honors endurance. The man who once stood at the center of battle and politics now presides over a stillness that speaks more eloquently than any monument. In that quiet, one senses the final harmony of his life, the union of purpose and restraint, of ambition tempered by reflection. The Potomac flows steadily below, carrying the reflection of sky and stone alike, impermanent yet unbroken, much like the republic he helped to found. There, on the banks of that river, the long story of George Washington finds its resting point. He remains not merely the beginning of the American nation, but its enduring conscience. His name, his image, and his principles have become woven into the daily life of the country he once guided with such patience. In every oath taken, every peaceful transition of power, every moment when moderation prevails over impulse, his example quietly persists. Time has placed distance between his century and ours, yet the measure of his integrity remains timeless. His life, marked by endurance and self-command, continues to suggest that the highest form of greatness lies not in the expansion of power, but in its deliberate restraint. And so, across the generations, the first citizen of the Republic remains its lasting guide, a silent assurance that character, once formed by duty, can outlive the boundaries of its own age. As the 19th century matured into its later decades, the world that Washington had helped to create entered a new and complicated phase. The Republic that once measured its progress in quiet fields and slow debates was now driven by the hum of industry and the restless pursuit of opportunity. The image of Washington endured through this transformation, but the meaning of his example shifted subtly. To a nation of merchants, inventors, and labourers, he came to symbolize steadiness amid motion, a reminder that discipline and character were the necessary companions of progress. His face appeared on banknotes, postage stamps, and civic buildings. His name was spoken in classrooms and courthouses alike. Yet the more familiar his image became, the further it drifted from the living presence it once represented. He was now a monument of virtue in a world preoccupied with movement, a moral compass in a time increasingly defined by ambition. The Industrial Revolution and the spread of mass communication elevated Washington's story from history into collective memory. Illustrated magazines and lithographs reproduced his likeness by the thousands, making him one of the first global icons of moral leadership. But with mass recognition came simplification. The complexities of his choices, the hesitations, compromises, and gradual moral awakenings faded beneath layers of patriotic gloss. He became the embodiment of moral certainty in a world that prized efficiency over reflection. His story, retold for children and citizens alike, was shaped less by historical nuance than by the need for example. To a population struggling with the inequalities of labour and the uncertainties of urban life, Washington offered a figure of integrity, a man who had held power without corruption and relinquished it without regret. At the same time, historians and statesmen continued to draw from his life to interpret the nature of American identity. For them, Washington represented continuity between the age of founding and the age of expansion. His moderation stood as a safeguard against extremes of ideology. In the halls of Congress, his name was invoked to temper debate. In public life, it was used to defend the balance between liberty and order. Yet as new waves of immigration transformed the social fabric of the nation, his image also took on a new role, as a unifying myth for a people of many origins. To those arriving from distant lands, Washington was presented not merely as the founder of a state, but as the first citizen of a nation built on principle rather than lineage. His example served as a kind of civic language through which diverse peoples could understand belonging. By the beginning of the 20th century, the reverence surrounding Washington had acquired a ceremonial formality. His birthday was observed as a national holiday, marked by solemn speeches and civic parades. Schools recited his farewell address as a ritual of citizenship. His monument, completed after nearly a century of effort, dominated the Capitol's skyline, a silent witness to the endurance of the Republic. Yet behind this public reverence, new generations began to ask quieter questions. What did it mean to revere a man from another century in a world of such rapid change? Could his deliberate, measured character still offer guidance in an age defined by innovation, speed, and uncertainty? The answers, when found, tended to return to the same truth, that Washington's greatness lay not in the specific challenges he faced, but in the way he faced them, with patience, integrity, and the refusal to yield to impulse. As the United States entered the modern age, confronting the shocks of World War and economic depression, Washington's figure continued to provide moral equilibrium. Leaders looked to him as the standard of civic responsibility, a reminder that authority carries with it the obligation of restraint. His life became a study in perspective, a demonstration that endurance was not passive but active, that silence could express conviction as surely as speech. In times of crisis, his example appeared anew. In the quiet determination of soldiers crossing distant seas, in the measured resolve of citizens rebuilding in the face of hardship. To invoke Washington was to remind the nation that its strength lay not only in its resources, but in its temperament, in its capacity for perseverance, guided by moral purpose. The mid-20th century brought a more critical examination of the founders as scholars and citizens alike sought to reconcile the nation's ideals with its realities. Washington's legacy, long enshrined in reverence, was now studied through the lens of complexity. His ownership of enslaved people, once a fact politely overlooked, became central to understanding the contradictions of the early republic. Historians began to ask how a man so devoted to liberty could live within a system of bondage. The answers were neither simple nor exculpatory, but they revealed a man struggling within the boundaries of his age, slowly awakening to the moral dissonance of his position. His decision to free the enslaved people under his control at his death was understood not as redemption, but as recognition, a final acknowledgement of the unfinished work his generation had begun. This more human understanding did not erode his stature. It made him more real. His greatness, viewed in full, was not the absence of flaw, but the presence of conscience. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Washington's image was revisited once more. For many Americans seeking equality and justice, he remained a figure of possibility, a man who had believed that character, not origin, defined worth. Yet his contradictions also served as a reminder of the nation's long delay in fulfilling its own ideals. The fact that his name could be invoked both in protest and in defense of the status quo demonstrated the continuing elasticity of his legacy. His presence in public life, enduring yet reinterpreted, mirrored the very process of democracy itself, a constant negotiation between memory and progress, principle and practice. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Washington's place in public consciousness began to shift from reverence toward reflection. His likeness, once unquestioned, became a starting point for dialogue about the meaning of leadership and the evolution of national identity. Museums and memorials began to emphasize not only his achievements, but his doubts, the personal writings in which he wrestled with questions of justice, unity, and mortality. To modern audiences, he appeared less as an unblemished hero and more as a thoughtful human being navigating the limits of his era. In that transformation, his relevance deepened. For a society increasingly skeptical of authority, his example of humility and disciplined service became newly instructive. The enduring fascination with Washington rests on the paradox he embodied, a man who achieved extraordinary power through the conscious rejection of excess. His leadership did not depend on charisma, ideology, or conquest, but on constancy. He believed that moral example was a form of governance, that a leader's restraint shaped the nation more profoundly than his ambition. This belief remains rare and difficult to sustain, yet it defines the foundation upon which the American experiment still rests. In every moment of national transition, from war to peace, from division to reconciliation, the image of Washington re-emerges, not as relic, but as compass. The quiet power of his example persists most vividly at Mount Vernon. There, on the gentle slopes above the Potomac, time seems to move at a slower pace. The air carries the same rhythm it did 2 centuries ago, the sound of the river folding softly against its banks. Within the house, his writing table stands unchanged, his books neatly aligned, his life preserved not in grandeur, but in simplicity. Visitors move through the rooms with subdued voices, aware that the space demands a kind of inward silence. The estate does not glorify victory. It honors equilibrium. The man who once held the future of a continent in his hands now rests in the calm he always sought, the peace of order, the dignity of completion. In this stillness, the full arc of his life can be seen more clearly. The boy surveying the wilderness, the soldier learning humility in defeat, the commander leading through endurance, the president governing by example, and the citizen returning willingly to the soil. Together, these moments form not a legend, but a continuous lesson. That greatness is built not in bursts of triumph, but in the quiet mastery of self. His legacy, stripped of ornament, remains the discipline of balance, the refusal of excess, the conviction that freedom survives only through restraint. Each generation, in rediscovering him, rediscovers itself, measuring once again the distance between promise and fulfillment. And so, through the long passage of centuries, George Washington endures, not as a monument to the past, but as a living standard for the present. His life reminds that history is not a fixed story, but a continuing task, one that each age must complete anew. The republic he helped to found remains a work in progress, its vitality dependent on the same virtues that once guided his hand: patience, honesty, and an unshakable devotion to duty. The man who became a nation did not end with his death. He continues in the conscience of those who still believe that liberty, to endure, must be governed by character. The centuries that have unfolded since Washington's time have changed the world beyond recognition. Yet his figure remains a still point in that ever-moving current. The great wars of the 20th century, the revolutions of science and technology, and the shifting of power across continents have all redefined the nature of leadership and the responsibilities of nations. Still, within the turbulence of history, Washington's example endures as a quiet argument for proportion. He is not invoked as a conqueror or as a prophet, but as the man who proved that restraint could hold greater power than ambition. In a world that has grown accustomed to spectacle, his modesty seems almost foreign, his silence almost radical. But it is precisely this measured quality, his refusal to be consumed by the passions of his age, that makes his memory essential to later generations. Every democracy that has come after the American experiment has wrestled with the same paradox he faced: how to balance liberty with order, individuality with duty, and progress with principle. Washington's life continues to offer an answer, not in doctrine, but in practice. His virtue was not theoretical. It was lived daily through deliberation. He tested his own motives, often in solitude, aware that the legitimacy of power depended on the purity of intent. His letters show a man deeply conscious of the distance between moral ideal and human imperfection, a man who carried the burden of example with reluctant endurance. In that awareness lies the essence of his legacy. He demonstrated that self-government begins with the governance of the self. For all the changes that have come since his century, this truth remains unaltered. In the quiet study of Mount Vernon, his words endure in the neat, slanted script that has outlasted the paper's age. He wrote of crops and debts, of weather and friends, but also of the fragile architecture of liberty. His concern was not only the creation of independence, but its preservation. The foundations of our empire are laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, he once observed. To him, a republic's endurance depended not upon laws alone, but upon the habits of its citizens, the daily exercise of patience, honesty, and responsibility. This conviction would echo through centuries of civic life, often unacknowledged, yet constantly present, shaping the moral expectation placed upon leaders and the public alike. It is the quiet thread connecting the debates of his time to the struggles of our own. When one considers the immense changes that followed his death, the rise of new nations, the expansion of rights, the challenges of equality, his world might appear distant, almost quaint. Yet his humanity bridges the distance. He was not a visionary who foresaw the modern age, but a man who confronted the unknown with discipline rather than certainty. This makes him, paradoxically, a modern figure, one who understood that progress, to be lasting, must proceed through order, and that justice, to be real, must be grounded in self-restraint. In times when history seemed to accelerate beyond comprehension, later generations returned instinctively to his steadiness, as if seeking the still rhythm that first gave coherence to the Republic. As the 20th century advanced into its latter half, Washington's name was spoken in contexts he could never have imagined. Astronauts carried a piece of his legacy beyond the atmosphere. His likeness travelled on coins exchanged across oceans. World leaders quoted him in speeches about peace and principle. Yet for all this global reach, the truest expressions of his influence remained local and personal. They appeared in the small ceremonies of public life, a judge taking an oath, a teacher explaining the meaning of civic duty, a family visiting a memorial, not for grandeur, but for reflection. His presence lived not in command, but in custom, not in monumentality, but in the quiet agreement that integrity was still the foundation of freedom. In scholarly circles, debates over Washington's place in history have continued to evolve. Some view him as a product of his time, his virtues bound by the limits of 18th century aristocracy. Others see in him a moral bridge to the modern world, a prototype of leadership through moderation. Both perspectives reveal essential truths. He was indeed a man of his era, conservative, cautious, sometimes slow to embrace change. But his conservatism was not rigidity. It was the measured patience of one who understood the weight of precedent. His caution was not fear, but a sense of proportion. He distrusted extremes because he had seen how easily passion could destroy what reason had built. That instinct, more than any speech or battle, defined his greatness. He made of prudence a form of courage. As modern historians have peeled away the myth to uncover the man, the result has not diminished him, but deepened him. The more one learns of his private doubts and restrained emotions, the more one recognizes the magnitude of his achievement. His virtues were not inherited, they were acquired through struggle. His reputation for dignity was the product of conscious effort, an armour forged against the temptations of power. Unlike the natural brilliance of other founders, Jefferson's eloquence, Hamilton's intellect, Washington's strength was earned through discipline. That discipline, constant and deliberate, transformed him from provincial officer to symbol of national unity. It was this transformation, achieved through years of endurance rather than moments of inspiration, that made him the founder not only of a government, but of a civic ethos. Even as the modern world moves further from his agrarian century, the moral balance he represented continues to resonate. His warnings against faction, foreign manipulation, and moral decay remain uncannily relevant, not as relics of the past, but as recurring conditions of human society. His vision of leadership as service rather than dominion stands in contrast to the self-assertive patterns that often dominate contemporary politics. To study him is to be reminded that authority without virtue becomes tyranny, and liberty without restraint becomes chaos. Between those two extremes, Washington placed the narrow path of character, the only foundation on which freedom can stand. The physical traces of his world endure quietly. Mount Vernon's pale facade overlooks the same waters that once reflected his final sunset. The rooms where he wrote and read remain preserved, each object carefully maintained by generations of caretakers who understand that these are not relics of conquest, but instruments of order. The visitor who walks its paths senses not grandeur, but gravity, an awareness that this was the home of a man who carried the burdens of history with the patience of an ordinary soul. The scent of wood, the soft creak of floorboards, the slow passage of light through narrow windows. These speak more truth about him than any statue or ceremony. In their simplicity lies the essence of his life: quiet work, deliberate movement, and the peace that follows duty fulfilled. Outside, the Potomac still glides past, indifferent to the centuries. The water carries with it the reflection of sky and memory alike, a reminder that history, like the river, is in constant motion. Generations have come and gone since Washington last stood on its banks, yet his influence continues to ripple outward, subtle but persistent. The republic he helped to build has endured wars, divisions, and transformations beyond imagining, but it remains, in its best moments, guided by the same discipline he embodied. The belief that strength derives not from passion, but from principle. In the end, George Washington's legacy cannot be confined to the boundaries of biography. It is not merely the record of battles fought or offices held, but the story of how moral restraint can shape the destiny of nations. His life stands as a continuous dialogue between action and conscience, between ambition and humility. It asks of every generation what he once asked of himself: how to act with courage without arrogance, how to lead without domination, and how to serve without expectation of reward. These questions, quietly persistent, ensure that his story remains unfinished. Each age answers them anew, and in that effort, the spirit of Washington endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a living measure of what civilization demands from those who govern and those who are governed alike. By the early decades of the 21st century, George Washington's image had settled into a paradox both familiar and unresolved. He stood at once as the most visible and the most distant of America's founders, his face imprinted on currency, carved into stone, invoked in civic ritual, yet largely detached from the living texture of daily life. Generations recited his name as a synonym for honor, though few could recall the details of his choices or the depth of his silences. The very success of his transformation into national symbol had, in a sense, hidden the man himself. And yet the continuing pull of his memory suggested that something deeper remained at work, an unspoken recognition that the moral architecture he represented was still the foundation on which the country rested. Each time the Republic faced division or disillusion, the figure of Washington re-emerged, steady, measured, and enduring, inviting the nation to remember what continuity required. The age that now claimed him was faster and more fractured than any he could have imagined. Information moved at the speed of thought. Leadership was measured by visibility more than by substance. In such an atmosphere, Washington's reserve seemed almost alien. His reticence, once a virtue, appeared out of step with an age that demanded constant explanation. Yet the contrast only deepened the fascination. Scholars, filmmakers, and citizens returned to him precisely because his manner offered relief from excess. His letters, written in careful script and restrained language, conveyed an attention to proportion that modern life too easily forgot. They revealed a man who believed that words should be weighed before spoken, that authority should rest on example rather than persuasion. In that respect, his relevance had not diminished. It had simply shifted, becoming a form of quiet opposition to the noise of his successors. Across the landscape of public memory, his presence remained constant, though seldom loud. The capital city that bore his name continued to mirror his sense of balance: broad avenues, open spaces, and a geometry designed to reflect reason rather than grandeur. Within its boundaries stood the monument that had taken nearly a century to build, a single obelisk rising without inscription. Its silence was deliberate, its simplicity an echo of the man it honored. Beneath it, visitors from across the world walked in slow procession, pausing not for spectacle, but for reflection. The monument's shadow moved across lawns and fountains as the day advanced, a reminder that greatness, like sunlight, is best perceived through its reflection on ordinary ground. In the evening, when the stone turned pale against the darkening sky, it seemed less a relic of the past than a reminder of the balance still required to hold the present together. Mount Vernon, too, remained a place of pilgrimage, though its meaning had evolved. Once a shrine to patriotic reverence, it had become a site of honest history. The curators of his estate no longer offered the uncritical adoration that once defined 19th century remembrance. Instead, they presented Washington as he was, a man of his time, shaped by duty, conscience, and contradiction. They preserved the records of his management, his accounts, and his correspondence with those he enslaved. Visitors encountered not an icon beyond judgment, but a human being confronting moral boundaries. This openness reflected a broader maturity in how the nation viewed him, less as an object of worship than as a partner in reflection. The strength of his example, it turned out, did not depend on perfection, but on the capacity for growth. Modern historians continued to uncover layers of his personality through his surviving papers. They found that beneath the formality of his letters lay a quiet introspection, a man often uneasy with praise, wary of passion, and haunted by the impermanence of achievement. He wrote of mortality not with fear, but with resignation, understanding that even the greatest works of men are temporary. What endures, he believed, are habits of mind and principle, passed silently from one generation to the next. That sense of continuity was to him the true meaning of legacy. A government could change, cities could rise and fall, but if the citizens remained guided by discipline and honesty, the republic would hold. It is a conviction that continues to sound with clarity even amid the uncertainties of the modern age. In classrooms, Washington's image once hung beside a flag and a clock, reminders of order and time. Now educators sought to present him as a participant in an unfinished experiment rather than as a completed ideal. Students studied his leadership as a process rather than a perfection, a sequence of judgments made under pressure, informed by experience, and tempered by humility. They learned that the revolution's endurance depended as much on patience as on bravery, that his victories were often less dramatic than deliberate. The famous crossing of the Delaware, the endurance at Valley Forge, the surrender of command, all were moments in which he chose discipline over impulse. To understand him, one had to see not only the actions, but the silences between them, the intervals of thought in which character was formed. The influence of Washington's precedent extended far beyond his own country. Across the world, leaders seeking legitimacy in new republics studied his example as a pattern for authority bounded by law. His resignation from power was cited in constitutional debates from Latin America to Asia, a demonstration that the greatest act of leadership could be to step away. In this sense, his legacy achieved a universality he could never have foreseen. It became a quiet testimony to the possibility of moral restraint within politics, a virtue both ancient and perpetually new. Yet even as his figure achieved global dimension, it remained deeply personal. Each visitor who stood before his tomb at Mount Vernon encountered not the grandeur of empire, but the humility of closure. The marble was plain, the inscription brief. Through the iron gate, one could see the two sarcophagi, his and Martha's, resting side by side in the half-light of the portico. The simplicity of the scene expressed the final balance of his life, the union of public duty and private devotion, the convergence of history and peace. Beyond the tomb, the river continued its slow passage toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of a life spent between motion and stillness. In that stillness, the story of George Washington finds its enduring truth. He was not a man without flaw, but one who learned to govern those flaws with reason. He was not a visionary who reshaped the world through imagination, but a steady hand who held it long enough for others to build. His genius lay in his proportion, in the awareness that no individual, however virtuous, could embody a nation, yet that a single example of integrity could guide one for centuries. His life remains an argument for moderation in times of extremity, for patience amid haste, for faith in the quiet power of measured action. And so his legacy continues, not as legend frozen in marble, but as a rhythm within the nation's conscience. In moments of noise and division, his calm endurance returns, like the low tide of the river that once reflected his gaze. It is the rhythm of continuity itself, the gentle insistence that freedom to endure must be governed by restraint. The Republic has expanded far beyond the boundaries he knew, but it remains tethered, however lightly, to the moral geometry he first drew, a balance between ambition and duty, speech and silence, power and humility. The man who once seemed the measure of his age has become the measure of its descendants, a reminder that the truest strength lies not in domination, but in the quiet mastery of self. In the first years of this new century, the measure of Washington's life began to appear less as static monument than as a continuing conversation about what leadership should mean in a republic that had grown vast and diverse. Historians and citizens alike returned to his letters and journals, searching for the human pattern beneath the marble. How he handled doubt, how he weighed competing loyalties, how he disciplined his temper and ambition. The results of that renewed attention were neither hagiography nor dismissal, but something quieter and more enduring. Recognition that the traits which sustained him through the founding era were not bound to that era alone. Patience, moral proportion, and the willingness to serve without possession of power remained as rare in the 21st century as they had been in the 18th. The institutions he had helped to form endured, changed by time, yet still marked by his restraint. Each peaceful transfer of authority, each moment when law prevailed over impulse, carried within it the echo of his example. Even the arguments that animated modern politics over the balance of government, the reach of liberty, the meaning of equality, were conducted within boundaries he had first traced. The Republic continued to test those boundaries, stretching and contracting with each generation, but the shape he had given it held. In moments of national crisis or fatigue, his figure re-emerged, not as saviour, but as reminder that self-government demands from its people the same self-command that he once practiced in himself. Beyond the borders of his own country, Washington's legacy assumed an almost philosophical character. Political theorists, diplomats, and teachers of history cited his farewell address not only for its warnings, but for its tone, a measured faith in the capacity of reasoned moderation to guide human affairs. In an age that often mistook noise for conviction, his calm seemed revolutionary. The universality of that calm ensured that his story remained relevant to cultures far removed from his own. Wherever a nation sought to reconcile freedom with stability, his example appeared, a lesson in the possibility of strength through limitation. At Mount Vernon, time continued its unhurried work. The river's slow movement, the measured rhythm of seasons, and the careful preservation of his home kept the continuity of his presence intact. Visitors arriving by boat or road found themselves entering not a shrine, but a living landscape. The orchard still yielded fruit, the field still opened toward the horizon, and the quiet geometry of the house still reflected his preference for balance over excess. The simplicity of the place, its lack of ornament or grandeur, reminded all who came that the man who once carried the weight of a continent had chosen to end his life surrounded by the ordinary tasks of cultivation. In that choice lay his most eloquent statement, that the pursuit of greatness must ultimately return to the care of the common and the lasting. What then remains of George Washington in a world that measures progress by speed and novelty? Perhaps it is precisely his slowness, his refusal to rush judgment, his insistence that deliberation is itself an act of courage. His life suggests that civilization is not sustained by brilliance or victory alone, but by the tempering influence of reflection. He understood that liberty without patience collapses into appetite, and authority without humility corrodes into domination. The equilibrium he achieved between these forces continues to define the ideal of republican character. To study him is to be reminded that a nation, like an individual, survives only when it can master its own impulses. As the centuries continue their movement, the meaning of Washington's example shifts, but does not fade. He remains both beginning and measure, the fixed point from which the moral coordinates of the Republic can be redrawn. The questions that shaped his life, how to use power justly, how to unite diverse people under common principle, how to balance private conscience with public duty, are asked again by every generation that inherits his experiment. The answers vary, yet the standard endures. It is found in his restraint, in his quiet faith that endurance itself is a form of victory, and so the narrative returns to the river and the stillness of his final home. The evening light settles over the water, the air carries the faint scent of the fields he once tended, and the house stands unchanged in its proportion. Inside, the tools of his labour rest where he left them. Outside, the nation he shaped continues its long and unfinished work. George Washington remains within that continuity, no longer the man at the head of an army, but the presence within the conscience of a people. His life, measured not by conquest but by composure, endures as proof that greatness, in its truest form, is inseparable from restraint. 2 centuries after his passing, George Washington has become something larger than a single life could contain, both presence and principle, a constant rhythm beneath the shifting tone of American experience. The Republic that once hesitated to believe in its own endurance has outlived empires and ideologies, yet the image of its first citizen continues to serve as a kind of moral metronome. Whenever the nation drifts toward extremes of ambition or despair, his steady figure re-enters the conversation, not through proclamation, but through memory. The words he spoke are read again, the gestures he made repeated in quiet ceremony, as if the country instinctively seeks balance by recalling the man who first defined it. In the centuries since, that memory has been shaped by the slow labour of scholarship and reflection. Each generation has stripped away another layer of reverence to see the man more clearly, yet each discovery of his humanity seems only to strengthen respect for his discipline. The young surveyor who learned to measure the wilderness became a statesman who measured himself, and through that self-command created a standard of leadership that no change of era can erase. He remains the rare figure whose authority grew out of humility, whose power rested on the refusal to hold it longer than duty required. This quality, so ordinary in appearance, has proven almost impossible to reproduce. In it lies the core of what later Americans have called character, the ability to act decisively while remaining inwardly still. To the modern observer, Washington's restraint may seem the product of another world. The loud urgency of contemporary life leaves little space for the quiet reflection he prized. Yet precisely because his rhythm feels alien, it continues to attract. His example offers an antidote to the noise of the age, a reminder that leadership does not demand constant speech, that authority need not rely on spectacle. Reading his correspondence, one finds few declarations of personal brilliance and many small notations of obligation. Debts settled, land improved, soldiers supplied, promises kept. These details, so mundane, reveal the essence of his greatness. He built endurance out of routine, integrity out of repetition, purpose out of patience. The Republic that followed him inherited not only institutions, but habits. The expectation that work would be done carefully, that judgment would follow evidence, that dignity would require self-restraint. The reverence for Washington that once bordered on worship has matured into something quieter but more durable. The statues that stand in his honour are visited less for ceremony than for reflection. The dates attached to his name mark pauses in the calendar rather than festivals. In this subdued remembrance lies a kind of intimacy. He is no longer a distant hero, but a companion in the continuing experiment of self-government. The questions he faced, how to unify a diverse people, how to preserve liberty without surrendering order, remain unsolved, and his example continues to provide not answers, but direction. He reminds that the health of a republic depends less on the brilliance of its leaders than on their willingness to subordinate ambition to responsibility. At Mount Vernon, the place where his public and private worlds finally merged, the rhythm of that lesson endures. The river still reflects the soft contours of the house. The fields still carry the marks of cultivation he once supervised. Visitors who walk the path to his tomb do so in a hush that requires no instruction. The simplicity of the site, the plain stone, the iron gate, the steady sound of water below, conveys more than any inscription could. It speaks of completion without finality, of a life that ended but a standard that continues. The quiet there is not emptiness, it is continuity, the silence of work still in progress. As long as the Republic endures, George Washington will remain its moral reference point. He cannot be confined to the category of hero or founder, for his presence transcends both. He stands instead as the embodiment of balance, the equilibrium between power and principle, between courage and caution, between the individual and the common good. His life offers a reminder that civilization, however advanced, rests on simple foundations: honesty, patience, and the acceptance of duty. These are not dramatic virtues, yet they have proven stronger than any ideology or weapon. They are, as he understood, the quiet architecture of endurance. The story that began in the fields of Virginia closes where it began, in the meeting of river and land, of solitude and service. The world around him has transformed, but the moral geometry he traced remains. Each generation returns to it, measuring its own conduct against the calm proportions of his example. And in that recurring act of remembrance, the nation renews itself. George Washington endures not because he was flawless, but because he made of imperfection a discipline. His life continues to remind that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields or in assemblies, but within the boundaries of the self. It is there, in the quiet mastery of conscience, that the republic he founded still finds its strength. In the quiet continuum of American life, George Washington remains an enduring point of return. His figure, though softened by the centuries, has never vanished from the national conscience. He is not summoned only in moments of triumph, but more often in the intervals of uncertainty, when the meaning of leadership falters, when the unity of purpose weakens, when the distance between principle and practice becomes too wide to ignore. Then his name, steady and unembellished, re-enters the public conversation. He stands as both memory and measure, a reminder that the Republic's strength lies not in the noise of its ambitions, but in the clarity of its restraint. For this reason, every generation rediscovers him, sometimes reluctantly, yet always with a sense of recognition, as if the passage of time has not altered his quiet authority, but merely tested its endurance. The fascination with Washington persists because his life reveals something elemental about the relationship between power and conscience. He lived in a world of expansion and conflict, but his greatness resided in the limits he placed upon himself. He could have ruled as others did in his century, through permanence, through personality, through the allure of command. Instead, he chose the narrow path of example, setting a precedent that would outlast the immediate victories of his era. The resignation of his military commission, the refusal of monarchical power, the voluntary retirement after 2 presidential terms, these were not gestures of withdrawal, but of deliberate completion. In each act, he demonstrated that the exercise of authority is honourable only when it prepares its own end. The republic that followed inherited from him not a template of perfection, but a habit of self-correction, a belief that strength without moderation is self-defeating. As the American nation expanded across the continent and eventually beyond it, that inheritance proved both fragile and necessary. Every challenge to the balance of its institutions, from civil war to civil rights, from depression to recovery, has been answered, consciously or not, through the example he left. His understanding that law must be sustained by moral discipline remains the unseen foundation of the Republic's endurance. The Constitution, often praised for its ingenuity, derived its living stability not from design alone, but from the character of those who first practiced it. Washington's presence in those early years was like the weight of a steady hand on a trembling scale. His sense of proportion, his reluctance to impose, and his belief in the virtue of process transformed a set of written articles into a functioning reality. That transformation, of words into order, of vision into practice, is what sustains any civilization, and it is the quiet legacy that carries his name. The gradual evolution of his image, from commander to statesman, from symbol to conscience, mirrors the nation's own journey from rebellion to permanence. In the first century after his death, his likeness was moulded into statues, painted onto canvas, and engraved onto the material of everyday life. Each generation sought to claim him as its own reflection, reshaping his story to suit the moment. The agrarian republic of the early 19th century saw him as farmer and patriarch. The industrial age, seeking moral guidance amid progress, emphasized his integrity and diligence. The 20th century, faced with global turmoil, drew upon his sense of proportion and balance. Each reinvention revealed less about Washington himself and more about the country's changing needs. Yet through all reinterpretations, a consistent thread remained: the conviction that in him the Republic had found its original measure of virtue. That measure continues to hold its quiet influence even in the fragmented modern world. In an age when information moves faster than reflection, when public life is defined by speed and spectacle, Washington's patience appears almost revolutionary. His ability to act deliberately, to allow decision to ripen through silence, stands as a forgotten art. The letters he wrote, careful, orderly, precise, contrast sharply with the urgency of contemporary communication. His leadership, built on observation rather than display, offers a corrective to the illusions of immediacy that often pass for progress. To study his example is to rediscover the discipline of waiting, the courage of understatement, and the humility that anchors true confidence. Mount Vernon, preserved in its quiet dignity, continues to speak this lesson to those who visit. The stillness of the estate, its wide view of the river and open fields, forms a living metaphor for the man himself. Broad in perspective, simple in design, firm in structure. There is no triumphalism in its architecture, no display of conquest, only the harmony of proportion, the balance of parts. Walking its grounds, one senses that Washington's greatest legacy was not the building of a nation, but the setting of its tone. He taught by example that public life must return to private virtue, that leadership without humility corrupts both ruler and ruled. The serenity of Mount Vernon is not nostalgia, but continuation. It keeps alive the rhythm of self-command that once guided the course of revolution and government alike. Beyond its borders, Washington's legacy has come to symbolize an ideal that transcends geography. His model of leadership, patient, principled, and proportionate, has inspired movements and constitutions far from the world he knew. In the aftermath of revolutions and restorations alike, his example has been cited as proof that power can coexist with morality, that liberty can sustain itself through law. This universality is perhaps his most enduring gift. He demonstrated that the strength of a free society lies not in the infallibility of its leaders, but in their willingness to acknowledge human limits. To the modern world, still grappling with the tension between authority and freedom, his life remains an argument for the virtue of measured governance. Yet his relevance is not confined to politics. It extends to the moral fabric of everyday existence. The calm discipline he practiced in the governance of himself remains a standard for personal conduct. He believed that integrity was the true foundation of happiness, that dignity arose not from privilege, but from consistency. His diaries record no grand revelations, only the daily exercise of principle: punctuality, restraint, courtesy, perseverance. These habits, sustained over a lifetime, produced the quiet authority that others mistook for greatness. In truth, it was simply constancy. The lesson endures because it is accessible. It demands not genius, but attention, not inspiration, but commitment. The twilight at Mount Vernon has long since settled into history, yet the figure who once stood there continues to watch over the republic he began. His presence lingers in the cadence of ceremony, in the architecture of public virtue, in the conscience that still questions power. His life remains the standard against which the nation measures its own maturity. To remember him is not to seek perfection, but to recall the possibility of balance, the balance between ambition and patience, liberty and law, individuality and common duty. The Potomac still carries its slow reflection of sky and stone, and the air over the estate holds the quiet continuity of purpose that once defined him. In that stillness, the story of George Washington does not end. It simply continues, renewed each time a people choose principle over impulse, and the long experiment of freedom begins again. In the long perspective of history, George Washington's present stands as both origin and equilibrium. His life remains inseparable from the slow unfolding of the American idea, an idea that continues to test its own strength with every generation. What he built was not a monument, but a framework, a moral and political geometry in which freedom could exist without devouring itself. In the centuries since his death, that framework has bent but never entirely broken, precisely because it was founded not on dogma, but on restraint. He left no doctrine, no manifesto. He left an example. Through that example, the Republic learned that its survival would depend not on perpetual revolution, but on perpetual moderation. Every challenge that followed, the struggles of governance, the conflicts over equality, the crises of faith, has drawn, whether consciously or not, from the reserve of dignity that his name still carries. Each era, in its own way, has tested the endurance of that example. The 19th century invoked him as the father of the nation's unity. The 20th rediscovered him as the conscience of its global power. The 21st century, more divided in thought and more connected in space than any before, returns to him as a question. Can the balance he embodied survive in an age of extremes? Can patience still govern ambition when the world rewards speed and deliberation is mistaken for weakness? In such times, Washington's silence becomes more eloquent than any speech. His example is less a relic of simplicity than a warning from experience, that nations, like men, must master their own impulses if they are to remain free. The qualities that defined him, duty, measure, and self-command, are not qualities of circumstance, but of character. They cannot be legislated, they must be cultivated. Washington knew this instinctively. His letters reveal a man constantly examining his own conduct, wary of pride, attentive to perception. He understood that power must appear just as well as be just, that the impression of virtue could sustain confidence when the reality of politics faltered. He did not confuse humility with weakness, nor dignity with distance. His composure was deliberate, an armour built through discipline, not temperament. In his restraint lay both protection and authority. Those who stood before him felt the weight of that composure, not as coldness, but as steadiness, the assurance that his will served not himself, but the office and the order that outlived him. That sense of proportion, so essential to his nature, shaped not only his leadership, but the moral landscape of the country he helped to form. Even as the Republic grew beyond his imagination, spreading across continents and oceans, the tone of its public life still echoed the discipline of its first commander. The presidential oath, the formalities of the courts, the patient procedures of law, each bore his imprint. They were not expressions of reverence alone, but of method, ways of translating the private virtues of honesty, patience, and civility into public practice. The endurance of those rituals, despite centuries of transformation, stands as the most visible proof of his continuing influence. Through them, the principle of moderation survives, the belief that order can coexist with liberty, that freedom requires form to preserve itself. It is sometimes said that Washington belongs to a world too distant to instruct the present, that his manners and methods are relics of a slower age. But this is to mistake substance for surface. His habits of deliberation were not the product of leisure, but of necessity. He knew the fragility of human judgment, and he built his decisions around that knowledge. In a time when passion and rhetoric could have destroyed the revolution from within, his composure preserved its course. In a world that now prizes immediacy, his patience offers a deeper form of relevance. He reminds us that enduring change comes not through impulse, but through endurance, that the slow movement of principle, though often unseen, is the true rhythm of progress. Mount Vernon, as it exists today, still communicates this rhythm. The estate lies open to the river, its quiet fields unfolding toward the horizon in measured lines. Nothing in its design suggests grandeur. Everything suggests proportion. The house is modest in scale, yet complete in harmony. Visitors sense, even before understanding, that its beauty lies in its restraint. It is a physical manifestation of Washington's temperament, composed, orderly, and at peace with its surroundings. To walk its grounds is to experience history not as spectacle, but as atmosphere. The continuity of patience turned into place. The slow passage of wind through the trees, the reflection of light on the water, the distant echo of footsteps on gravel. Each sound and silence seems to recall the deliberate calm with which he approached life itself. His tomb, set within that landscape, completes the narrative of his existence. There is no grand design, no elaborate inscription, only the simplicity of stone and the permanence of earth. It is fitting that the man who resisted coronation should rest without ornament. The quiet symmetry of the site captures the essence of his philosophy, that honour does not require elevation, that greatness can be contained within humility. Each visitor who stands before that modest vault participates in the same recognition, the understanding that his strength was not in conquest, but in completion. The power of his example lies in the fact that it ended precisely when it should have, leaving the work to others, trusting that principle, once set in motion, would continue without him. If he were to return and look upon the world that bears his influence, he would find much that had changed and much that had endured. The tools of communication, the reach of power, and the structure of society would seem foreign, but the human questions would remain the same. How does a people hold together across difference? How does liberty defend itself against its own excess? How can ambition be guided without being extinguished? These are not questions of time, but of nature. And Washington's life remains their most convincing reply. His answer, repeated through action rather than speech, was that the stability of a nation rests on the character of its citizens and the integrity of those who lead them. His life offers no illusions, only instruction, that freedom is the hardest discipline of all, requiring not only courage to obtain, but wisdom to sustain. The passing centuries have made his presence quieter, but no less vital. He lives not in monuments or rituals, but in the enduring expectation that leadership must mirror restraint, that service must temper ambition, that power must end where duty ends. In this, his influence has outlasted empires, technologies, and revolutions. It persists because it is built upon the one constant that history cannot erode, the moral capacity of human beings to govern themselves. That belief, which guided him through uncertainty and triumph alike, remains the foundation of every republic that claims descent from his example. And so, in the long evening of time, the figure of George Washington remains visible, not as a relic of the past, but as the quiet outline of continuity. The river at Mount Vernon still moves with the same slow rhythm. The house still watches over the landscape in calm proportion. In that stillness, the distance between his century and ours seems to vanish. His life continues not through legend, but through the discipline of memory, carried forward each time a people remember that liberty is not noise, but order, not motion, but measure, not conquest, but conscience. The long continuity of Washington's influence has turned into something almost elemental within the American imagination, like the steady rhythm of a tide that cannot be seen, but is always felt. The memory of him lives not in spectacle, but in the subtle expectation citizens hold about how power should behave, how authority should look, and what dignity demands. Across centuries of transformation, the idea of the presidency itself has remained bound to the tone he first established: sober, restrained, more occupied with responsibility than with reward. Each successor has in some way contended with his shadow, whether in imitation or rebellion. The quiet composure of the first president, his refusal to dramatize himself, became a mirror in which later leaders saw their own measure. This silent authority continues to define the broader civic temperament as well. The reverence Americans show to their Constitution, the ceremony surrounding the peaceful transfer of power, the moral expectation placed upon those who govern, all trace their lineage to his restraint. When a president raises a hand to take an oath, the gesture carries within it the memory of Washington standing on the balcony of Federal Hall, speaking softly but with full awareness that his words would echo through generations. The rituals of democracy, which seem so natural today, were in their inception acts of deliberate modesty. His example gave them shape, and they have survived because the discipline he embodied was woven into their practice. In the modern world, where speed and emotion often overtake reflection, Washington's composure feels almost foreign, yet that distance makes it more valuable. He reminds that leadership does not require noise, that the weight of command can be borne quietly, that progress can proceed without spectacle. The strength he demonstrated was the strength of containment, the ability to act without being consumed by action. In an age defined by constant exposure, his reserve reads not as aloofness, but as moral focus. His silence was never emptiness. It was the space in which judgment could form. That patience, learned through hardship, remains one of the rarest and most necessary forms of courage. His correspondence, preserved in careful script, offers an enduring portrait of this deliberate mind at work. He wrote not to impress, but to clarify, not to persuade, but to reason. Each sentence reveals a man engaged in the slow work of thought, measuring consequence before decision. To read those pages today is to encounter the rhythm of his mind, the long sentences shaped by duty, the even tone of a man unwilling to surrender to impulse. Through them, one sees that greatness is not sudden revelation, but the cumulative result of steadiness. It is this steadiness, more than any battlefield triumph or political innovation, that forms the essence of his legacy. The house at Mount Vernon remains the most tangible expression of that steadiness. Its symmetry, its moderate proportions, its quiet outlook over the river, all embody the values that defined his life. Visitors often speak of its calm, a stillness that seems to belong not only to place, but to time itself. Within its rooms, there are no signs of excess or display, only the evidence of order. Books arranged by subject, tools kept clean and ready, the modest furnishings of a man content with sufficiency. The space holds the echo of his presence, the deliberate movement of footsteps, the turning of pages, the quiet weight of reflection before decision. To stand there is to understand how private discipline can sustain public virtue. Outside, the Potomac moves with its patient rhythm, a continuity that mirrors the nation's own endurance. The river has seen centuries of change, yet it continues its course as it did when Washington surveyed its banks in youth. It carries the reflection of the land he once called home, of the republic he helped to shape. In its calm persistence, one senses the character of the man himself, firm without rigidity, constant without rest. The river, the house, the name, all have become part of a single continuity that defines what it means to endure with grace. Even as scholarship grows more critical and history more inclusive, the measure of Washington's virtue remains. He was a man of his century, bounded by its assumptions, yet capable of seeing beyond them. His acceptance of imperfection, his gradual awakening to moral contradiction, and his effort to reconcile action with conscience make him more human, not less exemplary. The fact that he learned and changed strengthens his relevance. It reminds that leadership is a process, not a condition, that integrity is forged in the willingness to correct oneself. The freedom he fought to secure would have little meaning without that inward discipline. His life, viewed whole, is a meditation on the coexistence of power and humility. In the end, what survives of Washington is less a set of deeds than a certain balance of spirit. The Republic continues to change, as all living nations must, yet the moral centre he established remains its quiet inheritance. The weight of his presence can still be felt in the measured solemnity of civic ceremony, in the expectation of honour attached to public service, in the unspoken belief that restraint is a form of strength. He stands not as an unreachable ideal, but as a continuing invitation to act with proportion, to think before speaking, to build slowly what may last long. That invitation, renewed each generation, is what keeps his legacy alive. As night falls over Mount Vernon, the fields darken into the same outline he once knew. The river catches the faint glint of distant lights, carrying them along its surface like echoes of passing centuries. The air holds the calm that follows long labour. In that stillness, the story of George Washington reaches its true conclusion, not in triumph or finality, but in endurance. He remains what he always was, the measure of balance, the steady hand on history's wheel, the living reminder that greatness begins not in command of others, but in mastery of oneself. In the modern imagination, Washington's name endures not merely as an artefact of founding, but as a living vocabulary of order and principle. He has become a quiet measure by which Americans, and indeed people in other republics, still test the meaning of public virtue. In an age when the speed of change threatens to erase the memory of beginnings, his example continues to supply a kind of gravity. He reminds that freedom without patience is only impulse, and that the dignity of a nation is found in the self-discipline of its citizens. The slow, deliberate cadence of his life now reads almost as moral instruction, a rhythm of thought before action, reflection before declaration, and service before ambition. This continuity of moral presence has endured through reinterpretation. Each century has reread Washington in its own image, and each has found something different yet essential. The romantic 19th century saw him as the noble patriarch who had brought civilization to the frontier. The pragmatic 20th century regarded him as a craftsman of institutions, a symbol of method and organization in an expanding world. In the 21st, a more questioning age, he has come to embody both virtue and paradox. A man shaped by the contradictions of his time, yet capable of transcending them through will and discipline. That the same figure can accommodate so many perspectives speaks not to confusion, but to depth. He remains large enough to contain both the ideals and the doubts of those who inherit his experiment. In academic study and public conversation alike, the effort to reconcile his greatness with his humanity has become central to understanding the early republic. The awareness of his participation in slavery, once muted by reverence, now stands at the centre of honest historical reflection. It does not diminish him, it completes him. It shows that even the most disciplined of men was bound by the blindness of his century, and that moral evolution can occur within the boundaries of imperfection. His gradual movement toward emancipation, the decision to free those he held in bondage through his will, represents the quiet awakening of conscience that often precedes great change. To acknowledge that process is to see his life not as myth, but as instruction, that progress begins with recognition, that the work of freedom is never finished, and that character consists not of flawlessness, but of the willingness to face one's flaws. In this way, Washington continues to speak across time. His letters on civic responsibility, his reflections on unity and moderation, his warnings against faction and hatred of partisanship, all read now with renewed clarity. They are not the artifacts of a distant era, but the expressions of a permanent condition. Human society, no matter its technology or speed, remains governed by the same temperaments, the same impulses toward division and pride. Against these, his counsel of restraint stands as an enduring remedy. It asks not for perfection, but for patience, not for blind conformity, but for mutual respect grounded in reason. The Republic, which he once described as a grand experiment, still depends upon that discipline. Its survival is less a matter of law than of habit, of the quiet virtues that he practiced without spectacle. Mount Vernon, preserved with such care, continues to reflect this lesson in form and atmosphere. The house overlooks the river with calm authority, its symmetry suggesting a life organized by measure. Inside, the rooms are modest yet balanced, their arrangement revealing the order of a mind that sought harmony in all things. The objects remain as he left them: the desk at which he wrote, the chair where he read, the tools of work and cultivation that spoke to his faith in diligence. The estate is not a museum of greatness, but a landscape of proportion. To walk its grounds is to sense that his achievement was not conquest, but coherence, the integration of personal virtue and public duty into a single, disciplined existence. Outside, the Potomac flows in slow continuity, its surface reflecting the same blend of movement and calm that defined the man. The river's persistence mirrors the Republic's own, sometimes turbulent, often tested, but unbroken. It carries with it the light of passing hours, much as his legacy carries the conscience of passing generations. The rhythm of the water is the rhythm of endurance, the steady pulse beneath the noise of history. Standing there, one feels that Washington's life did not end so much as it merged with that enduring flow. His influence remains like the current itself, invisible yet constant, shaping without force, guiding without demand. In the end, his story is the story of how moderation became a form of heroism. He proved that power could be contained by character, that leadership could serve rather than dominate, that freedom could survive through order. These truths, once revolutionary, remain radical still. They offer a counterpoint to every age that mistakes excitement for progress or noise for conviction. The lesson of his life is that greatness requires calm, and that the measure of a civilization lies in its capacity to emulate such calm. The quiet of Mount Vernon, the deliberate pace of his letters, the unadorned dignity of his monument all speak the same language, that liberty is sustained not by the passion of the moment, but by the patience of principle. And so, across the widening centuries, the figure of George Washington endures, neither saint nor relic, but a man whose restraint became a nation's conscience. The experiment he began continues still, altered by time, but guided by his rhythm. In every act of fairness, in every moment when duty outweighs desire, the echo of his presence remains. He is the calm between tempests, the steady voice that reminds a restless world that the highest expression of freedom is not defiance, but self-command. The enduring fascination with George Washington rests upon the subtle equilibrium between distance and familiarity. He feels both unreachable and near, an austere figure set apart by history, yet somehow still human enough to reflect the best possibilities of those who study him. His life invites contemplation because it resists simplification. He was not the product of any single virtue, but the steady harmonizing of many: caution and courage, dignity and doubt, patience and determination. That harmony, so rare in politics and so easily lost in the noise of ambition, became his most lasting contribution to the civilization he helped create. 2 centuries after his passing, the pattern of his character still provides a measure against which power, leadership, and civic responsibility are quietly judged. As America has matured, Washington's image has moved through phases of myth and revision, yet it has never disappeared from public conscience. Early generations venerated him almost to sanctity. Later generations, armed with new scholarship and more candid sensibilities, stripped away the aura of perfection to recover the man within the monument. In that recovery lies a deeper reverence. His strength no longer depends upon marble grandeur or unblemished legend, but on the realism of struggle, his constant effort to reconcile principle with imperfection, ambition with restraint. It is there, in the work of balance, that his true greatness resides. He is not remembered because he was flawless, but because he practiced self-correction in an age when few could imagine it as virtue. The modern world, restless and fragmentary, has little patience for silence, yet Washington's composure continues to exert a moral pull. His was a kind of leadership that measured success not by applause, but by continuity. When he spoke, he did so to clarify rather than to command. When he acted, it was with the intention of restoring rather than reshaping. This discipline, the refusal to exaggerate one's own importance, forms the centre of his legacy. It is a quality that finds resonance far beyond the boundaries of statecraft. In homes, in classrooms, in quiet exchanges between generations, the lesson of his demeanour remains. That character is not built in moments of triumph, but in the long labour of self-restraint. Each generation returns to Washington's example when confronted with the turbulence of its own age. During the Civil War, his likeness hung in both Union and Confederate encampments, a symbol claimed by opposing ideals yet unified by the respect it commanded. During the Great Depression, his endurance was invoked as evidence that national character could outlast economic despair. In the anxious years of the Cold War, his measured confidence became a moral compass in a world divided by ideology. Even now, when technology connects and fragments society in equal measure, his presence endures as a model of composure in the face of change. His legacy adapts not by altering its essence, but by revealing new relevance in each passing century. To stand before the Washington Monument is to experience the paradox of his memory made physical. The structure rises alone, simple in design, yet immense in implication. Its surface carries no inscription, its form no decoration. The emptiness is deliberate. It invites reflection rather than command. The obelisk points toward the sky but remains firmly grounded in the earth, much as Washington himself balanced aspiration with realism. From its summit, the city he founded extends outward in ordered geometry, avenues, domes, and arches radiating from a central axis. The plan of the capital, conceived in the measured symmetry he admired, has become a lasting representation of his sense of proportion. To look upon it is to see the physical continuation of his temperament, a landscape designed for deliberation, not haste. Yet if the city and the monuments express his public legacy, it is Mount Vernon that holds his private truth. There, the rhythm of life moves at the same measured pace it did in his time. The fields stretch toward the horizon with patient simplicity. The river flows with indifferent grace. Within the house, the evidence of his daily discipline remains. ledgers balanced in his careful handwriting, correspondence organised with precision, the implements of work kept in ordered readiness. Nothing in the estate suggests grandeur. The beauty of the place lies in its moderation, its refusal of excess. It is the physical expression of the principle he lived by, that stability is a greater achievement than conquest. The visitor who stands at his tomb senses the fullness of that idea. The resting place is neither ornate nor imposing. The plain stone bears only his name and dates, as though to insist that the life itself, not the memorial, carries meaning. The silence of the spot feels appropriate, for his story ends not in proclamation, but in the quiet fulfillment of duty. Around it, trees cast shifting patterns of light and shade, and the sound of the river blends with the rustle of leaves. Time moves softly there, dissolving the boundaries between centuries. It is easy to imagine him walking the paths above the water, measuring the sky, thinking of the nation whose future he would not see but whose continuance he trusted to the discipline of its citizens. In this enduring scene lies the essence of Washington's achievement. He transformed restraint into a creative force, turning limitation into legacy. The republic he founded was not secured by the brilliance of words or the fervour of revolution, but by the steady habit of balance. His moderation was not timidity, it was moral architecture. It allowed liberty to mature without self-destruction, to expand without disintegration. The institutions that followed, executive authority, civilian control of the military, the regular transfer of power, were shaped in his image, not because he imposed them, but because he embodied them. He gave to political life a tone of reason that outlasted his lifetime, and in doing so established the foundation upon which a nation could grow in strength without losing its centre. What remains of him now is not merely the memory of deeds, but a continuous standard of conduct. The tone of public service, the ideal of the citizen leader, the expectation that power must yield to principle, all trace their origin to his example. Even as history broadens to include voices once unheard, his presence endures as the still axis around which that widening circle turns. The study of his life has become in the end a meditation on the nature of responsibility itself. He shows that freedom is not a condition to be enjoyed, but a discipline to be maintained, that greatness depends less on inspiration than on endurance, and that the truest victories are those won within the limits of self-command. Thus the story of George Washington reaches its final, unending moment. His life, complete yet continuous, remains intertwined with the life of the nation he began. The river still moves beyond his resting place, reflecting the light of each new morning. The city that bears his name still strives toward the balance he once embodied. And the people who call themselves free still measure their conduct, however unconsciously, against the rhythm he left behind. He endures not as a distant founder, but as a living principle, a reminder that the highest expression of leadership lies not in conquest or command, but in the calm and enduring labour of duty fulfilled. In the unfolding centuries, George Washington's legacy has become less a chapter of history than a condition of memory. He lives now not only in books or monuments, but in the quiet expectations that surround the exercise of responsibility. His name has become shorthand for integrity, his image a silent assertion that reason can prevail over passion. When citizens speak of public trust, of moderation, of duty fulfilled without reward, they are, often without knowing, repeating the language of his life. It is this diffusion into the moral atmosphere, more than any monument or anniversary, that marks the permanence of his achievement. The shape of that achievement remains simple, but immense. Washington proved that authority could be both strong and restrained, that liberty could survive discipline, and that democracy could be stable when guided by character. His belief that governance was a moral act rather than a performance, still stands at the heart of the Republic's endurance. Though the world around him has changed beyond recognition, the principles he lived by retain their quiet authority. Each time a leader yields power peacefully, each time a citizen subordinates impulse to duty, his example reappears, woven invisibly into the habits of a free society. Modern scholarship, freed from the reverence of earlier ages, continues to illuminate the texture of his humanity. It reveals a man often uncertain, aware of his limitations, and yet steadfast in purpose. His greatness was not innate, but constructed through effort, the steady accumulation of discipline over pride, patience over haste. The documents he left behind show him learning from failure as carefully as from success. The young officer who once overreached at Fort Necessity became the general who won through endurance rather than audacity. The commander who faced mutiny learned to govern emotion by reason, to temper authority with respect. That evolution, sustained over a lifetime, transformed experience into wisdom. It is the arc of that growth, not the myth of flawless virtue, that gives his story its continuing resonance. The Washington who belongs to the present age is neither idle nor abstraction, but a reminder that moral progress is incremental. His example suggests that history's most enduring contributions are made not by those who act in passion, but by those who maintain proportion amid uncertainty. In a time when the world often celebrates intensity over reflection, his calm appears almost revolutionary. He demonstrated that restraint can be creative, that self-control can be the foundation of liberty, and that humility, when joined to conviction, can shape destiny. These truths, discovered in the quiet rhythm of his life, retain their power because they speak to conditions that do not change. Mount Vernon endures as a living testament to that rhythm. Its measured architecture, its ordered fields, and its view of the slow-moving Potomac embody the harmony he sought in life. The estate is not a monument to conquest, but to completion, a place where labour and reflection meet. Visitors who walk its grounds sense the serenity of balance, the feeling that history here moves at the pace of conscience. The air carries the same stillness that once surrounded his final years, a silence filled not with absence, but with the continuation of purpose. Each season alters the landscape, yet leaves its structure intact, as if nature itself had agreed to preserve the tone he set. Beyond its borders, the capital city that bears his name continues to express the geometry of his mind. Its avenues radiate from a centre, its buildings face each other in measured alignment, and its open spaces suggest the dignity of order. Even when politics becomes turbulent, the city's design holds a visible calm, the architectural echo of his belief that government must balance power with openness. The Washington Monument, rising at the centre, embodies the same restraint. Unadorned, self-contained, a single line joining earth and sky. It stands not as a symbol of dominance, but of proportion, a physical translation of his moral equilibrium. As history lengthens, his presence softens, but does not fade. The Republic has grown far beyond his imagining, its boundaries extended across oceans, its society transformed by diversity and innovation. Yet within that vastness, the original tone remains. The principle that leadership is service, that power must yield to law, that freedom depends upon discipline. These ideas, set in motion by his example, continue to define the nation's moral centre. When the country stumbles, as all nations do, it finds steadiness in his memory. He is not summoned as hero or saviour, but as standard, the quiet reminder of what balanced character can achieve. The twilight at Mount Vernon deepens as each year passes, and yet the river continues its slow reflection of sky and stone. The scene changes in detail, the growth of trees, the passing of light, but the feeling remains unaltered. It is as if the place itself has learned endurance from the man who once walked its paths. His life, viewed now through the long lens of time, resolves into its simplest truth: that greatness is not noise, but composure, not ambition, but steadiness, not domination, but the mastery of one's own will. This is the lesson that outlives battles and policies, the inheritance that cannot be exhausted. So the story closes not with a final triumph, but with continuity. The man who once seemed larger than life has become part of the quiet order of things. The river's flow, the measured beat of civic ritual, the pause of reflection before decision. His example remains a fixed point within the ever-turning world, the silent assurance that the ideals of moderation and honour can survive time itself. In every generation that chooses deliberation over haste, duty over vanity, and conscience over power, George Washington lives again.